The November wind carried the scent of coming snow across Pine Grove Cemetery, cutting through Thomas Brennan's jacket like a reminder that some cold goes deeper than weather.
Right there
He
on the
stood
ledger.
before Margaret's headstone, same spot
connects
he'd
to the Shell
occupied every
Corporation.
Saturday for the past 3 years, holding a conversation with granite that never answered back. The whiskey bottle in his right hand was still sealed, but the sun was setting earlier these days, and the dark had a way of making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Margaret Elizabeth Brennan, beloved wife, 1964 to 2021. The dates carved into stone told nothing about the woman who'd laughed at his terrible jokes, who'd held his hand through 25 years of detective work that brought more darkness home than light, who'd faced ovarian cancer with a courage that shamed every act of bravery he'd witnessed in the Marines or on the force. The stonecutter hadn't left room for all that. Maybe that was mercy. Some stories are too big for epitaphs. Tom's phone buzzed in his pocket, the vibration intrusive against the cemetery's silence. He ignored it. Phones had been ringing for 3 years with well-meaning friends, former colleagues checking in, numbers he didn't recognize, offering final expense insurance or extended car warranties. None of them understood that he'd come to Minnesota to stop answering, to find peace in the woods by the lake where he and Margaret had planned to retire together. Instead, he'd found isolation wearing the mask of solitude, and most days he couldn't tell the difference anymore. The phone buzzed again, persistent. Tom pulled it out with his free hand, ready to silence it permanently, when he saw the name on the screen. Claire Donovan, the woman who'd bought the old Cross place 3 days ago, the Lakehouse that had sat empty since Victoria's death. Tom had meant to introduce himself, offer the neighborly welcome that small lake communities supposedly specialized in, but 3 years of hermit living had atrophied his social graces. He'd watched from his cabin as the moving truck arrived, watched a younger woman help an older one navigate the treacherous steps, watched them carry boxes that looked too heavy for their frames. He'd done nothing. Now she was calling him. The local sheriff had probably given her his number, told her Tom was former NYPD, someone who could help if she had questions. Tom stared at the phone, at Margaret's grave, at the whiskey bottle, 3 points of a triangle that defined his current existence. Detective, widow, drunk, not necessarily in that order. He answered, "Mr. Brennan, this is Claire Donovan. I'm sorry to bother you, but Sheriff Mitchell said you might be able to help me with something." Her voice carried the controlled urgency of someone trained not to panic, someone who'd learned to stay calm while everything burned. Tom recognized it instantly. He'd spent enough years cultivating that same tone. "It's Tom. What's the problem, Ms. Donovan?" "Claire, and I'm not sure problem is the right word. It's more like a question I can't answer, and it's the kind of question that suggests other questions I probably don't want to ask." She paused, and Tom heard water in the background, the lap of lake against wooden supports. "I found something in the house. Actually, my mother found it. And there's something else, a sound, coming from underneath." Tom closed his eyes. He'd known this call would come eventually, known it from the moment he'd seen the county liquidation notice for the Cross property. Some truths don't stay buried, no matter how much dirt you pile on top. He'd spent 5 years trying to let Victoria's death lie, trying to accept the official story, even though every instinct he'd honed over 2.5 decades told him it was a carefully constructed fiction. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. Tom opened his eyes and looked at Margaret's grave one more time. "Looks like I can't keep avoiding it after all," he said to the stone. "You always said I'd know when it was time to stop hiding." He set the unopened whiskey bottle at the base of her headstone, a promise kept and a promise made. "Save that for me. I'll be back when this is finished." The drive from the cemetery to the lake house took him past the sheriff's office, past the small marina where he kept his boat covered for winter, past the intersection where the old Homeward Veterans Project sign still stood, faded and forgotten. Tom had watched that project from its announcement to its collapse, had seen the hope it generated in the local veteran community, had attended the groundbreaking ceremony where Commissioner Raymond Cole had given a speech about honoring those who served. The same Raymond Cole who'd somehow gotten richer while the project died, whose lake house had doubled in size while the veteran housing sat abandoned. Tom's hands tightened on the steering wheel. 3 years of trying not to be a detective anymore, 3 years of telling himself that some fights were too big for one retired cop, 3 years of letting Margaret's death be his excuse for letting everything else go. The shame of it sat in his chest like a stone. The Cross Lakehouse appeared through the trees as the last light faded from the western sky, and Tom's breath caught despite himself. He'd driven past this place 100 times, had seen it in all seasons and all weathers, but something was different now. Lights burned in the windows, warm and yellow against the gathering dark. Smoke rose from the chimney. Life had returned to a place that had held its breath for 5 years, and the sight of it stirred something in Tom's chest that felt dangerously close to hope. Claire Donovan met him on the porch, and Tom's first thought was that she looked like someone who'd recently lost a war. Mid to late 30s, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, eyes that held the particular wariness of someone who'd seen too much and been thanked too little. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt that hung loose on a frame that suggested recent weight loss. And when she shook his hand, her grip was firm, but her fingers were cold despite the fire he could see burning inside. "Thank you for coming, Tom. I know it's late, and you don't know us from Adam, but I didn't know who else to call. The sheriff said you used to be a detective in New York, that you were the kind of cop who actually gave a damn." She stepped back to let him enter. "I'm hoping that's still true." Tom followed her inside, and the warmth of the place wrapped around him like an embrace. The interior of the lake house was exactly as he remembered from the single time he'd been inside, during the open house Victoria had held for the Homeward Project Board. Good bones, Margaret would have said, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of someone who built for permanence rather than profit. Victoria Cross had been an engineer in the Army, had learned to build things that lasted under conditions designed to destroy them. Everything she'd touched carried that signature durability. An older woman sat in a chair by the fire, an oxygen concentrator humming quietly beside her, its tube running to a cannula in her nose. She looked up as Tom entered, and her eyes held the same assessment he'd seen in 1,000 witnesses and victims and fellow cops over the years. The kind of eyes that measured a person's character in the time it took to extend a hand. "Mom, this is Tom Brennan. Tom, my mother, Grace Donovan." Claire made the introduction with the efficiency of someone conserving energy for battles yet to come. Grace Donovan extended a thin hand, and when Tom took it, he was surprised by the strength in her grip. "Mr. Brennan, forgive me for not standing. The emphysema doesn't appreciate stares or polite gestures." Her voice carried traces of the South, softened by decades but never quite erased. "My daughter thinks I'm crazy, but I'm hoping you'll be the kind of man who understands that crazy and true aren't always opposites." Tom found himself smiling for the first time in longer than he cared to calculate. "Ma'am, I spent 25 years in homicide. I learned early that the sanest people are usually the ones everybody calls crazy. What did you find?" Grace gestured to the small table beside her chair, where a leather-bound journal lay open, its pages yellowed with age but the handwriting still clear. Next to it sat a brass compass, tarnished green but still intact, its face engraved with initials Tom recognized immediately. VC. The same initials that had appeared on the police report 5 years ago, on the death certificate that had closed Victoria Cross's case with bureaucratic finality. "I found that journal behind the bathroom mirror," Grace said. "It was tucked into a space between the wall studs, wrapped in plastic like someone wanted to make sure it survived. And the compass was wedged into the support beam down by the water. Claire brought it up this morning when she went down to check why there's knocking coming from underneath the house." Tom picked up the compass, feeling its weight, noting the way the needle swung to magnetic north with the reliability that had made such instruments essential to navigation before GPS reduced everything to satellites and screens. The engraving on the back read, "True North," and below it, a date, September 2019. 1 month before Victoria had died. "May I read the journal?" Tom asked, though he already knew what he would find there. He'd suspected for 5 years that Victoria Cross had been documenting something, that her death had been too convenient, too perfectly timed. The journal was confirmation of instincts he'd trained himself to ignore. Claire nodded, but it was Grace who spoke. "You should know something first, Mr. Brennan. Before you read a single word, you should know that I've been dying for 3 years. The doctors gave me 6 months back in 2021. I'm still here, and I don't know why, except that I think I do know why, and that's the part my daughter thinks is crazy." Tom set the compass down and gave Grace his full attention. In his experience, the things people said right before they told you what they really meant were usually more important than the confession itself. "I was a nurse in the Army, Vietnam era. Saw things that would turn your hair white if it wasn't already. Grace's smile was gentle, but her eyes were steel. After I got out, I worked for the VA for 30 years, counseling mostly, helping veterans transition, helping them deal with what they'd seen and done. I met a lot of good men and women who'd given pieces of themselves to this country. Most of them just wanted a chance to live normal lives afterward. She paused to adjust her oxygen, and Tom noticed the way Claire moved instinctively closer, ready to help but careful not to hover. The dance of a daughter who'd been managing her mother's decline long enough to know when intervention was needed and when it was insult. 5 years ago, I was counseling a Marine named Aaron Franklin, good man. Lost his leg in Kandahar, spent 2 years learning to walk again, met a woman who loved him anyway, had two beautiful little girls. He got accepted into the Homeward Veterans Project, one of the first 3 families approved for housing. He was so excited, Mr. Brennan. He called me the day they broke ground on his house, said it felt like coming home after a long deployment. Grace's voice thickened, and she took a moment before continuing. Tom waited. He'd learned long ago that some stories couldn't be rushed. 3 weeks after Aaron moved his family into that house, the whole thing collapsed. Aaron died. His wife Jennifer died. His daughters Emma and Sophia, 6 and 4 years old, they died too. The official report said it was a foundation failure caused by ground saturation and soil shifting. Tragic accident, no one to blame. Just bad luck and worse timing. Tom felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always preceded the moment when a case stopped being about paperwork and started being about people. But you didn't believe that. Aaron called me 2 days before he died, left a voicemail while I was in a session with another veteran. He said the house was making sounds it shouldn't, that there were cracks appearing in the walls, that the county inspector had signed off on everything but his gut was telling him something was wrong. He asked if I could help, if I knew anyone who could look at it independently. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. I was going to call him back that evening, but I had a doctor's appointment, and they found a shadow on my lung, and suddenly I was the one who needed help. By the time I remembered his message, he was already dead. The room was silent except for the hum of the oxygen concentrator and the crackle of the fire. Tom understood now why Grace was still alive 3 years past her expiration date, understood the particular kind of will that could keep a body functioning when the spirit had unfinished business. He'd seen it before in witnesses who refused to die until they testified, in victims who held on until their attacker was caught, in cops who survived until their partner's killer was brought to justice. You think Victoria Cross discovered something about Aaron Franklin's death? Tom said quietly. You think that's why she died? I don't think, Mr. Brennan, I know. Grace reached for the journal, opened it to a page marked with a strip of fabric, and read aloud. Day 47, Hayes Development delivered the concrete mix for the Franklin Foundation today. I tested a sample using the portable equipment I brought from my Army days. The compression strength is barely 60% of the rated specification. When I confronted Marcus Hayes about it, he told me Commissioner Cole had personally approved the substitution to save costs. I told him that saving costs on structural concrete is how you kill people. He told me I was being dramatic. I'm documenting everything now because I think they're going to try to make me stop asking questions. Tom took the journal from Grace's hands, careful with the aged pages, and began to read. Victoria Cross had possessed the methodical mind of an engineer combined with the detail orientation of someone who'd learned that in certain situations, documentation was the difference between life and death. She'd cataloged every discrepancy, every substitution, every cost-cutting measure that compromised safety. Hayes Development billing for Grade A lumber, but delivering Grade C. Electrical components that failed inspection, being installed anyway after the inspector's signature appeared on approval forms. Concrete foundations that required 6 inches of rebar getting 4. Roof trusses spaced at 24-inch intervals instead of the 16 inches specified in the engineering plans. The journal detailed meetings where Victoria had raised concerns, emails where she'd requested clarification, phone calls where she'd been told to stop making trouble. It documented the Franklin family's death with clinical precision, noting the way the official investigation had been rushed, the way the structural engineer's report had been sanitized, the way questions had been discouraged and questioners had been marginalized. The final entries, written in the week before Victoria's death, carried a different tone. Not fear exactly, but the grim determination of someone who'd decided that silence was complicity and complicity was unacceptable. If you're reading this, I didn't make it to the federal oversight meeting, Victoria had written on what Tom assumed was the final page. They've made it clear that my continued investigation is unwelcome. Commissioner Cole suggested yesterday that accidents happen to people who don't know when to stop. Marcus Hayes told me his company has connections with people who solve problems quietly. I'm not brave enough to pretend these aren't threats, but I'm also not coward enough to let Aaron Franklin's children die for nothing. The proof is here. All of it. Financial records, photographs, audio recordings, testimony from workers who were told to keep quiet. If the house survives, maybe someone honest will find it. Someone who still believes that truth matters more than convenience. Tom closed the journal carefully, his mind already assembling the pieces, seeing the pattern that Victoria had documented with such precision. This wasn't just corruption. This was systematic fraud that had led directly to 4 deaths, followed by a cover-up that had required the cooperation of county officials, law enforcement, and possibly federal oversight agencies. The scope of it was staggering. The audacity of it was breathtaking. You said there's a sound coming from underneath the house, Tom said to Claire. When did you first hear it? Claire had been standing by the window watching the lake, but she turned at his question. Last night, 3 knocks, very deliberate, very rhythmic. They came from the support beams where they go into the water. I thought it was maybe thermal expansion or the wood settling, but it happened again this morning. Same pattern. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, like someone trying to get attention. Tom stood, his knees protesting the movement in a way that reminded him he was 58 and no longer the young Marine who'd run 5 miles before breakfast. Show me. The 3 of them made their way carefully down to the water's edge, Grace moving slowly but steadily with her portable oxygen unit, refusing Claire's offered arm with the quiet dignity of someone who'd surrendered enough independence already. The lake was still, its surface reflecting the stars that had begun to emerge in the clear November sky. The temperature had dropped with the sunset, and Tom's breath formed clouds in the air. The Lakehouse stood on 6 support beams sunk deep into the lake bed, heavy timbers that Victoria had specified in her construction plans to handle ice flows and seasonal water level changes. Tom knelt at the edge of the platform, ignoring the protest from his knees, and examined the nearest beam with the small flashlight he'd pulled from his jacket pocket. The wood showed the expected weathering from 5 years of exposure to water and elements, but the structural integrity appeared sound. Victoria had built for permanence. Tom was about to suggest they go back inside when the sound came. 3 distinct knocks, wood on wood, emanating from somewhere beneath the surface. Tom's flashlight beam cut through the dark water, and there, wedged between 2 of the support beams about 8 feet down, something metallic caught the light. He couldn't make out details from this angle, but the glint was unmistakable. Something was down there, something that didn't belong to the natural accumulation of lake debris. I saw that too, Claire said quietly. I was going to dive for it this morning, but the water temperature is probably 40 degrees and I didn't have a wetsuit. I was planning to call a dive service tomorrow. Tom sat back on his heels, his mind working through implications and possibilities. Victoria Cross had been found drowned after her boat capsized during what the official report called a sudden storm. Her body had been recovered 3 days later, bloated and unrecognizable, identified through dental records. The boat had been found capsized but intact, no evidence of collision or mechanical failure. The sheriff's investigation had concluded accidental death by drowning, case closed within a week. But Victoria Cross had been an Army engineer who'd served in Iraq, who'd dealt with boats and water in conditions far more challenging than a Minnesota lake. The idea that she'd capsize in a sudden storm strained credibility. The idea that she'd capsized just days before a federal oversight meeting where she planned to present evidence of fraud and negligence didn't just strain credibility, it shattered it. I have a wetsuit in my truck, Tom said, making a decision that felt simultaneously reckless and inevitable. It's been 3 years since I used it, but I think it'll still work. If you've got a rope and a waterproof bag, I can bring up whatever's down there. Claire studied him with the careful assessment of someone trying to decide if she was looking at help or hindrance. You don't even know us. You don't owe us anything. Why would you risk hypothermia diving into a freezing lake for people you met 20 minutes ago? Tom stood, brushing dirt from his knees, and looked at the lake house standing above them, solid and true in the darkness. Because Victoria Cross built this place for people who'd served their country and needed a second chance. Because Aaron Franklin and his family deserve better than a house that killed them and an investigation that buried the truth. Because I've spent 3 years telling myself that some fights are too big for one person, and I'm tired of listening to my own excuses. He turned to face both women, seeing in their faces the same mixture of hope and wariness he'd seen in his own mirror every morning for longer than he cared to admit. And because 25 years as a detective taught me that when you ignore evidence, you become complicit in whatever crime that evidence would have exposed. I've been complicit in Victoria's death for 5 years. I'd like to stop now if you'll let me. Grace Donovan's eyes glistened in the starlight, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd been waiting a very long time to hear certain words. Mr. Brennan, I think you just answered why I'm still alive. I think we were all supposed to be here, at this moment, for this reason. Some people call that coincidence. I call it purpose. Tom retrieved the wetsuit from his truck, along with climbing rope and a waterproof salvage bag he'd used years ago for evidence recovery in the East River. The wetsuit was tight across his chest and belly, a reminder that retirement had softened muscles that service had once hardened, but it would serve. He secured one end of the rope to the support beam, tied the other around his waist, and waded into water so cold it stole his breath despite the neoprene barrier. The dive was short but disorienting in the darkness, with only his flashlight cutting through murky water that reduced visibility to arm's length. Tom descended carefully, following the rope, feeling his way along the support beam until his fingers found the metallic object that had reflected his light. It was heavy, perhaps 5 pounds, wedged deliberately between two beams in a way that suggested intentional placement rather than random accumulation. Tom worked it free with numbed fingers, secured it in the waterproof bag, and kicked toward the surface. His lungs burned by the time he broke through, gasping in the cold November air. His body had already shivering despite the wetsuit's insulation. Claire was there immediately, helping him to shore, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders while he fumbled with the waterproof bag's seal. Inside was a brass compass, identical to the one Grace had found earlier, except this one was attached to a small waterproof case made of heavy plastic with rubber seals. Tom's shaking hands struggled with the latches until Claire gently took it from him, her fingers more nimble, her expression intent. The case opened to reveal a USB drive wrapped in multiple layers of plastic film, a small notebook protected by the same method, and an audio recorder that looked like it had last been manufactured sometime in the previous decade. Everything was dry. Everything was intact. Victoria Cross had prepared for every contingency, including her own death. They returned to the warmth of the house, where Tom shed the wetsuit and accepted hot coffee with hands that shook from cold and adrenaline in equal measure. Grace sat forward in her chair, her oxygen temporarily forgotten, her entire being focused on the items Claire had spread carefully across the table. The notebook proved to be a continuation of the journal Grace had found, but these entries were different, more personal, less documentation and more confession. Victoria writing to someone she didn't expect to meet, explaining not just what she'd found but why it mattered. I keep thinking about Aaron Franklin's daughters, one entry read. Emma was 6. She drew me a picture of their new house with flowers in the garden and a swing set in the yard. She told me it was going to be their forever house. I have that picture in my office. I look at it every day, and I think about how I approved the foundation pour, even though I had concerns. I told myself the inspector had signed off on it, that surely the county wouldn't allow substandard work. I trusted the system. Emma Franklin is dead because I trusted the system. Another entry, dated 1 week before her death. Marcus Hayes called me this morning. Drunk, I think, or close to it. He said he was sorry about Aaron's family, said he never meant for anyone to get hurt. Then he told me that if I presented my findings to the Federal Oversight Committee, he'd make sure I regretted it. He said Commissioner Cole has connections that reach further than I can imagine. He said accidents happen to people who make trouble. I told him that 4 people already had a fatal accident because of his corners cut and his greed. He hung up on me. I'm recording everything now. If something happens to me, at least there will be a record. The final entry was dated the day Victoria died. I'm going out on the lake tonight to clear my head before tomorrow's meeting. I've copied all the evidence to multiple drives, hidden them in places where honest people might find them if they're looking. The house will survive. I built it to last. Maybe it will shelter someone who needs it. Maybe someone who still believes in truth will live there one day and find what I've left behind. If you're reading this, you're that person. Don't let them bury this. Don't let Aaron and Jennifer and Emma and Sophia die for nothing. The truth is worth defending, even when defending it costs everything. Tom sat back in his chair, the coffee warm in his hands but doing nothing to thaw the cold that had settled in his chest. He'd suspected for 5 years that Victoria Cross had been murdered. Now he had her own words confirming that she'd been threatened, that she'd known she was in danger, that she'd prepared for her death with the same methodical precision she'd applied to everything else in her life. The USB drive required Claire's laptop to access, and as the files populated the screen, Tom felt the familiar weight of evidence settling onto his shoulders. Financial records showing money flowing from the Homeward Veterans account into shell companies that existed only on paper. Photographs of construction sites showing materials that didn't match the specifications. Audio recordings of meetings where Commissioner Cole directed contract awards to Hayes Development despite competitive bids from more qualified firms. Victoria had documented everything, had built a case that would have destroyed careers and sent people to prison. And then she died in a convenient boating accident, and all of it had been buried with her. "We need to take this to the FBI," Claire said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "This isn't just local corruption. This is federal fraud involving veteran housing funds. The FBI has jurisdiction." Tom wanted to agree. Every instinct he'd developed over 25 years of police work told him to secure the evidence, contact the appropriate authorities, let the system work the way it was designed to work. But 5 years of watching that same system fail Victoria Cross, fail Aaron Franklin, fail everyone who trusted that justice would prevail had taught him a different lesson. "The FBI field office is 6 hours from here," he said quietly. "By the time agents arrive, by the time they verify jurisdiction and open an investigation, Commissioner Cole will know someone's asking questions. He'll have time to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, call in favors from whatever connections he has." Victoria tried going through channels. It got her killed. "So what do you suggest?" Claire's eyes challenged him, and Tom recognized the look. He'd seen it in his own mirror often enough. The look of someone who trusted the system and been betrayed by it. Someone who didn't know if they had the strength to fight a battle that seemed already lost. Before Tom could answer, Grace spoke, her voice quiet but carrying absolute certainty. "We finish what Victoria started. We find all the evidence she left behind. We build a case so airtight that even powerful men with connections can't escape it. And then we make sure it reaches people who can't be bought or intimidated." Tom looked at this 70-year-old woman with failing lungs and unshakable determination, and he thought about Margaret, about the promises he'd made at her grave, about the unopened whiskey bottle he'd left behind. Some fights were too big for one person, but 3 people armed with evidence and motivated by justice deferred too long. That might be different. "There's someone you should meet," Tom said, making another decision that felt simultaneously reckless and right. "A man named David Chen. He lives off the grid about 40 miles from here. Former Marine, served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He did carpentry work for Victoria on the Homeward Project. He was also the last person to see her alive." Claire's eyes sharpened. The police report didn't mention any witnesses. The police report mentioned a lot of things that weren't true and omitted a lot of things that were. Tom stood, feeling the weight of 3 years of inaction lifting from his shoulders like a burden he'd carried so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. David Chen saw what happened to Victoria Cross the night she died. He's been living in the woods ever since, waiting for someone to care enough to ask him about it. Grace reached for Claire's hand, and Tom saw the understanding pass between them. The wordless communication of 2 people who'd learned to read each other's thoughts through years of shared struggle. Claire nodded, almost imperceptibly, and Grace smiled. "Then I guess we go talk to Mr. Chen," Claire said. "But Tom, you should know something before we go any further. I'm not FBI anymore. I was forced to resign 8 months ago after I investigated a case involving a senator's embezzlement. I followed the evidence where it led, and it led to people who didn't want to be found. They destroyed my career to protect themselves." So if you're looking for someone with authority or resources or political capital, you're looking at the wrong person. Tom felt something shift in his chest, some recognition of kinship with this woman who'd sacrificed her career for truth the same way Victoria had sacrificed her life. I spent 25 years in homicide, and the only unsolved case I have is the one I'm not supposed to investigate. I moved 3 states away to escape it, and it followed me here. I think we're exactly the right people for this, Claire. We're the people who have nothing left to lose except our integrity, and we've already proven we value that more than our careers. Grace's oxygen concentrator hummed in the silence that followed, measuring out breaths, counting time that she shouldn't have, but somehow did. Finally, she spoke, and her words carried the weight of prophecy and promise combined. Aaron Franklin called me Ma. His own mother died when he was young, and I think I filled that space for him somehow. He trusted me with his fears and his hopes and his nightmares from Afghanistan. When he died, I made him a promise. I told his spirit that I'd find out why, that I wouldn't let his death be meaningless, that I'd make sure his daughters were remembered. She looked at Tom and Claire with eyes that had seen too much death and refused to accept one more. I've been alive for 3 years I shouldn't have been, waiting to keep that promise. You two showing up here now with the courage to finish what Victoria started? That's not coincidence, that's purpose. That's grace, and I don't just mean my name. Tom felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, something that felt dangerously close to purpose, to meaning, to the reason he'd become a cop in the first place. Not for the badge or the pension or the authority, but for the moments when you could stand between the innocent and the guilty and say, not here, not while I'm standing. We'll go see David Chen in the morning, and he said, tonight I suggest we all get some rest. Tomorrow we start building the case that Victoria died trying to build. And we don't stop until everyone who contributed to Aaron Franklin's death answers for it. Claire walked him to the door, and on the porch in the cold November night, she paused. Tom, can I ask you something personal? You can ask. I might not answer. I didn't answer, but you can ask. When you dove into that lake tonight, you weren't just recovering evidence. You were testing yourself, weren't you? Seeing if you still had it. Whatever it is that makes someone risk hypothermia for strangers and justice. Tom looked out at the lake, dark and still beneath the stars, and thought about Margaret's grave, about the whiskey bottle he'd left behind, about 3 years of running from everything that had once defined him. I spent 3 years trying to forget I was a detective. Turns out you can't forget who you are. You can only pretend long enough that the pretending becomes another kind of truth. Tonight reminded me what the real truth feels like. And what does it feel like? Cold, dangerous, absolutely necessary. Tom smiled, and it felt strange on his face, like a muscle he'd forgotten how to use. Get some sleep, Claire. Tomorrow we wake up the ghosts, and they're going to have a lot to say. He drove back to his cabin through darkness broken only by his headlights, the evidence bag secure on his passenger seat, his mind already working through next steps and potential obstacles, and the 100 small decisions that would determine whether justice prevailed or evil triumphed through inertia and indifference. The cabin waited for him, cold and empty, exactly as he'd left it that morning when he'd driven to Margaret's grave with a bottle of whiskey and no particular reason to return. But something had changed. The cabin was still cold and empty, but Tom was neither of those things anymore. He had a purpose. He had allies. He had evidence that could bring down powerful men who'd thought themselves untouchable. And somewhere in the woods, David Chen was waiting for someone to finally ask him about the night Victoria Cross had died. Tom built a fire, made coffee he wouldn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table with Victoria's notebook spread before him. He read through the night, absorbing every detail, every name, every date, building the case in his mind the way he'd built 1,000 cases before. As dawn broke over the lake, painting the water gold and pink, Tom allowed himself to hope that maybe Margaret had been right, that maybe he would know when it was time to stop hiding. The time was now, the fight was here, and Thomas Brennan, retired detective, widower, recovering hermit, was ready to stop running from the one case he'd never had the courage to solve. Victoria Cross deserved justice. Aaron Franklin and his family deserved to be remembered for more than a tragic accident. And somewhere in the Minnesota woods, David Chen deserved to finally tell the truth he'd been carrying for 5 years. Tom picked up his phone and sent a text to Claire. Meet me at the diner on Route 7 at 8. We go see Chen after breakfast. Bring your mother if she's able. This is going to take all of us. The response came almost immediately. We'll be there. Grace is already awake. She says she had dreams about Victoria last night, that Victoria told her thank you. I don't know if I believe in that kind of thing, but my mother does. And right now I'm willing to believe in anything that gets us closer to the truth. Tom set the phone down and looked at the evidence spread across his table. The physical manifestation of one woman's courage and another woman's determination and 4 innocent lives lost to greed and corruption. The case was 5 years cold. The people responsible had power and connections and every reason to fight exposure with everything they had. But Tom had spent 25 years learning that the truth was patient, that evidence didn't decay with time, that justice delayed was still justice possible. Victoria Cross had built this case brick by brick, document by document, recording by recording. She'd hidden it where people like Claire and Grace and Tom would find it, people who still believed that some things mattered more than convenience or safety or self-preservation. The sun rose higher, burning away the morning mist, and Tom Brennan, who'd spent 3 years trying to be no one in particular, remembered what it felt like to be exactly who he was supposed to be. A detective, a seeker of truth, a man who'd made promises to the dead and intended to keep them. The fight was beginning. The ghosts were waking. And Thomas Brennan was finally, mercifully, blessedly ready. The diner on Route 7 had probably looked exactly the same in 1980 as it did now, all chrome and red vinyl, and the kind of coffee that came in infinite refills, because quality was negotiable, but quantity was sacred. Tom sat in a corner booth with sight lines to both entrances, old habits asserting themselves whether he needed them or not. The breakfast crowd was sparse this early on a Sunday morning, just a few locals who nodded at him with the cautious friendliness reserved for people who'd lived in the area long enough to be familiar, but not quite long enough to be trusted. Claire and Grace arrived exactly at 8, and Tom noted the way Claire scanned the parking lot before helping her mother from the car, the way she positioned herself between Grace and the door as they entered, the way her eyes cataloged exits and potential threats with the automatic assessment of someone trained to expect danger. Former FBI, she'd said. Tom recognized the permanent wariness that came with that particular education. Some lessons you learned with a badge never quite left you, even after the badge was gone. Grace moved slowly but steadily, refusing the walker that Claire had tried to bring, accepting only the portable oxygen concentrator that hummed quietly at her side. She slid into the booth across from Tom with a small smile that suggested she knew exactly how much effort simple movements cost her and had decided the effort was worthwhile. You look like you didn't sleep, Grace observed, her voice carrying the gentle directness of someone who'd spent decades counseling people through their demons. Couldn't turn your mind off, or didn't want to? Tom smiled despite himself. Little of both. I spent the night reading everything Victoria left behind. The woman was meticulous. Every document cross-referenced, every claim supported by multiple sources. If she'd lived to present this evidence, Cole and Hayes would be in federal prison right now. The waitress appeared with coffee, and they ordered food none of them would eat with much enthusiasm. Toast and eggs for form's sake, fuel for bodies that would need strength for what lay ahead. When the waitress left, Claire leaned forward, her voice low despite the relative privacy of their corner booth. I spent the night going through the financial records on the USB drive. Victoria documented a fraud scheme that's elegant in its simplicity. Federal money comes in through legitimate homeward veterans grants. Hayes Development submits invoices for premium materials and skilled labor. Cole approves everything without competitive bidding. The money goes to shell companies that exist only on paper, then filters back to Cole's and Hayes' personal accounts through a series of transfers designed to obscure the trail. She paused, her investigators' instincts clearly engaged despite her resignation. But Victoria found the trail. She tracked every dollar, identified the shell companies, connected them to real estate holdings and offshore accounts. This isn't just fraud. This is organized financial crime with a body count. Tom absorbed this, fitting it into the framework he'd been building since the previous night. How much money are we talking about? The Homeward Veterans Project was allocated $12 million in federal funding. Based on Victoria's analysis, approximately $8.7 million was diverted through the fraud scheme. The actual construction cost for the 3 houses they built, using substandard materials and cut-rate labor, was probably under 2 million. They pocketed the difference. Grace's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. Aaron's house cost $2 million of federal money, and they built it with materials worth maybe $600,000. His daughters died in a house that was essentially held together with greed and lies. The raw pain in her voice silenced the table. Tom thought about his own daughter, the one he'd never had, the family he and Margaret had planned, but cancer had stolen before they could begin. He thought about Emma and Sophia Franklin, 6 and 4 years old, excited about their forever house with the swing set in the yard, crushed under walls that should have protected them, but instead became their tomb. "We're going to make this right," Tom said quietly, the promise feeling inadequate even as he spoke it. "It won't bring them back, but we'll make sure everyone knows their names, knows what happened, knows who's responsible." They finished breakfast in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts, their own reasons for being here, their own ghost demanding attention. When Tom paid the check, the waitress gave him a curious look but said nothing. Small towns had long memories and active gossip networks. By tomorrow, everyone would know that Tom Brennan had breakfast with the new people from the Cross Lakehouse, and speculation would begin about what that meant. Let them speculate, Tom thought. Before this was over, there would be plenty to talk about. The drive to David Chen's place took them deep into national forest land, along dirt roads that turned to little more than tire tracks, past signs warning that cell service was non-existent and help was a long way off. Tom led in his truck, Claire following in her sedan, both vehicles struggling over ruts and rocks that suggested Chen had chosen isolation with the same care Victoria had chosen her evidence cache locations. After 40 minutes of bone-jarring navigation, Tom's GPS announced they'd arrived at coordinates that showed nothing but trees and a small clearing where the road ended. He killed the engine and stepped out, immediately aware of being watched. The sensation was familiar from his Marine Corps days. The prickle at the back of the neck that said unseen eyes were evaluating threat level and calculating response options. "Mr. Chen," Tom called out, keeping his hands visible, his voice carrying the particular tone that said he came in peace but wasn't defenseless if peace wasn't an option. "My name is Thomas Brennan. I'm a retired detective and former Marine. I'm here with 2 women who need to talk to you about Victoria Cross. We're not armed and we're not a threat. We just want the truth about what happened 5 years ago." For a long moment, nothing moved except pine branches in the wind. Then a figure emerged from the tree line, rifle held low but ready, eyes scanning the vehicles and their occupants with the systematic assessment of someone who'd learned to trust nothing and verify everything. David Chen was smaller than Tom had expected, maybe 5'8", lean in the way of men who'd traded muscle for endurance, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years outdoors and the hard eyes of someone who'd seen too much combat to ever fully come home. He wore surplus military gear, faded and patched but functional, and moved with the economy of motion that spoke of discipline maintained long after the uniform came off. "You say you're a Marine." Chen's voice was rough, underused, skeptical. "What unit?" "2nd Battalion, 6th of Marines, 85 to 89. Camp Lejeune. Never saw combat, shipped out just as Desert Shield was ramping up. Spent most of my time doing security details and wondering what real Marines look like." Tom kept his hands visible, his posture open. "But I learned enough to recognize a combat veteran when I see one, and to know that Semper Fi isn't just words to the men who've earned the right to say it." Something shifted in Chen's expression. Not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of possibility. His eyes moved to Claire and Grace, still in the sedan, and Tom saw calculation happening behind those hard eyes. "The older woman, she's sick. Terminal from the look of her. Why bring a dying woman to the middle of nowhere to talk about something that happened 5 years ago?" "Because she made a promise to a dead Marine," Tom said simply, "and she's still alive to keep it. That seems like reason enough." Chen lowered the rifle completely, though he didn't set it down. "Aaron Franklin's counselor. I heard him talk about her. Called her Ma because his own mother died when he was young." He gestured toward a cabin that Tom hadn't noticed. So perfectly did it blend into the surrounding forest. "Come inside. If you're here to talk about Vic, we're going to need time." The cabin's interior was austere to the point of ascetic, but everything was military precise in its organization. Weapons secured in a gun safe, MREs stacked by date, water filtration system, ham radio equipment, solar panels visible through the window. This wasn't a vacation cabin or a weekend retreat. This was a fighting position, a last stand, a place where a man could hold out against the world if the world decided to come for him. Chen gestured them to sit at a handmade table that showed the craftsmanship of someone who'd learned carpentry as therapy rather than trade. Grace lowered herself carefully into a chair. Her breathing labored from the walk, but her eyes were alert and focused entirely on Chen. "You were Aaron's squad leader in Afghanistan," she said, not a question. "He talked about you in our sessions, said you were the reason he made it home alive after he lost his leg, said you carried him half a mile under fire to the medevac point." Chen's face showed nothing, but his hands tightened on the table edge. "I got him out. Didn't get the other 7. Didn't get Martinez or Johnson or Williams or any of them. Aaron made it home missing a leg. The rest of them came home in boxes. And then Aaron came home from Afghanistan only to die in Minnesota because someone wanted to steal money from a program meant to help him," Grace said quietly. "You've been carrying that, haven't you? The guilt that you saved him once, but couldn't save him again." Chen's jaw worked, and for a moment Tom thought he might order them out. Then something broke in those hard eyes, some wall that had held for too long under too much pressure. "I was there the night Vic died," Chen said, the words coming out like a confession, like a wound being drained. "I saw what they did to her." The cabin went silent except for Grace's oxygen concentrator and the wind in the pines outside. Tom felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always preceded critical testimony, the moment when a case transformed from theory to prosecutable fact. "Tell us," Tom said. "Everything, from the beginning." Chen stood and moved to the window, looking out at the forest that had become his fortress. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat affect of someone reciting trauma they'd replayed 1,000 times. "I met Vic through the Homeward Project. She hired me to do the finished carpentry on the houses. Good work, honest pay, building something that mattered. We both served in Iraq, different times, different units, but we spoke the same language. The language of people who've seen what happens when someone cuts corners on construction in a war zone. Buildings collapse. People die. Vic said she'd seen too many schools and hospitals fall because contractors pocketed money meant for proper materials. She swore the Homeward houses would be built right, built to last, built to honor the people who'd live in them." He turned from the window, his face etched with pain that had nothing to do with physical wounds. But then Hayes Development that started delivering materials that didn't match the specifications. Concrete that was watered down, lumber that was rotten inside, electrical components that failed basic inspection. Vic confronted Marcus Hayes. He told her Commissioner Cole had approved the substitutions to bring the project in under budget. She said bringing a project under budget by killing people wasn't acceptable. Hayes said she was being dramatic. She said Aaron Franklin's family was going to live in one of these houses, and if anything happened to them because of cut corners, she'd personally make sure everyone responsible went to prison. Claire had pulled out a notebook and was writing, old FBI habits asserting themselves. "How long before the Franklin house collapsed did this confrontation happen?" 3 weeks. Vic was documenting everything by then. Photos, audio recordings, material samples she'd sent to independent labs for testing. She told me she was building a case that she'd present it at the federal oversight meeting scheduled for November. She asked if I'd testify about what I'd seen on the construction sites. I said yes. I said I'd stand with her. Chen's hands clenched and unclenched, the only outward sign of the emotion churning beneath his controlled surface. Then Aaron's house collapsed during his daughter's birthday party. 4 dead. County inspector ruled it a foundation failure due to soil conditions. Vic knew better. She had the concrete samples that proved the foundation was substandard. She had photos showing rebar spacing that didn't meet code. She had everything needed to prove it was criminal negligence, not an accident. Grace's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Aaron called me 2 days before he died. Left me a voicemail saying the house was making sounds it shouldn't, that there were cracks appearing. I never called him back. I had a doctor's appointment and they found cancer, and I forgot. And he died." "You didn't kill Aaron," Chen said with surprising gentleness. "Coleman and Hayes killed Aaron. They killed his wife and his daughters, and then they killed Vic when she tried to make them answer for it." Tom leaned forward. "You saw it happen. I was fishing. Middle of the night, couldn't sleep, PTSD keeping me awake. I go to the lake when the nightmares are bad, sit in my boat in the dark, let the water calm what the war broke. That's where I was when I saw Vic rowing toward shore. She often worked late, checking the construction sites by moonlight. She was like that, obsessive about details, about making sure everything was right. Chen's voice dropped lower, and Tom had to strain to hear. Then two boats came from the opposite direction, running without lights. I recognized Coleman's voice before I could see him, loud and angry. Hayes was with him. They intercepted Vic in the middle of the lake. The argument carried across the water. Coleman telling her she was going to destroy everything over paperwork. Vic saying 4 people were dead because of their greed. Hayes saying she needed to learn when to keep her mouth shut. Vic saying she'd already copied all the evidence, that even if they stopped her, the truth would come out. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in as Chen's testimony painted images Tom didn't want to see but couldn't look away from. Hayes rammed her boat, not hard enough to capsize it immediately, but enough to rock it violently. Vic tried to steady herself, but she was alone and they had 2 boats. Coleman circled around, creating a wake that made her boat unstable. She was shouting at them to stop, her voice carrying across the water. I could hear the fear in it, and I sat in my boat 200 yards away, and I did nothing. You were unarmed, outnumbered, too far away to help, Tom said, recognizing the symptoms of survivors' guilt, the particular poison that infected those who witnessed atrocity and survived when others didn't. I was a coward, Chen said flatly. Just like in Fallujah when my squad got ambushed and I froze while better men died. Vic's boat capsized. She went under. She came back up, tried to swim toward the overturned hull. Hayes used an oar to push the boat further away from her. She went under again. They waited, engines idling. I could see them watching the water, waiting for her to surface. She did once more, maybe 30 seconds later, arms flailing. Then she went down and didn't come back up. Grace made a sound like a wounded animal, and Claire put a hand on her mother's shoulder. Tom felt cold spreading through his chest, the particular ice that came with hearing evil described in clinical detail. Coleman and Hayes waited maybe 10 minutes, Chen continued relentlessly, as if now that he'd started, he couldn't stop until everything was purged. Then Coleman called someone on his phone. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I heard him say, "It's done," before he hung up. They left, running without lights, heading back toward town. I sat in my boat until sunrise, telling myself I'd imagined it, that it couldn't have been what it looked like. Then I saw the search boats the next morning, heard the sheriff on his radio saying they had found Vic's capsized boat, heard him call it a tragic accident. Chen finally looked at them, his eyes haunted. I went home and I packed, took everything I owned that mattered, which wasn't much, and I came here, built this place with my own hands, far enough from civilization that I could pretend the world didn't exist. That afternoon, 2 sheriff's deputies showed up before I'd even finished loading my truck. Said they'd heard I'd been fishing near where the accident happened. Asked if I'd seen anything. I said no. They said that was good, that it was terrible what happened to Ms. Cross, but sometimes bad things happen to people who don't know when to leave well enough alone. One of them mentioned how my VA disability payments could get lost in bureaucratic processing. The other one mentioned how tragic it would be if another accident happened so soon after Ms. Cross's death. They threatened you, Claire said, her voice tight with controlled anger. They let me know the cost of talking, and I decided I couldn't afford it. Chen's shame was palpable, filling the cabin like smoke. Aaron was my squad leader. He saved my life more times than I can count. His family died because I didn't have the courage to testify about the substandard construction. Then Vic died trying to get justice for them, and I didn't have the courage to testify about her murder. I've been hiding in these woods for 5 years, alive when people better than me are dead. Grace stood with effort, moved around the table and took Chen's weathered hands in her thin ones. My son died in Vietnam. He was 19 years old and he'd been in country for 6 weeks when a landmine turned him into a memory. For years I told myself I should have stopped him from enlisting, should have found a way to keep him home. The guilt almost killed me. But a very wise chaplain told me something I've never forgotten. He said the only person responsible for pulling a trigger is the person whose finger is on the trigger. You didn't kill Aaron's family. You didn't kill Victoria. Coleman and Hayes did. The only guilt you carry is the guilt of surviving, and that's a burden every combat veteran knows. Chen's control finally broke and tears ran down his weathered face as Grace held his hands, and Claire looked away to give him privacy, and Tom felt his own eyes burning with the weight of everything this man had carried alone for so long. When Chen finally composed himself, he pulled away from Grace and wiped his face with rough efficiency. "You said you're building a case. What do you need from me?" "Your testimony," Tom said. "Everything you just told us, sworn and recorded. Victoria documented the financial fraud and the construction negligence. You can provide eyewitness testimony to her murder. Together, it's enough to bring federal charges that Coleman and Hayes can't escape." "They'll kill you before they let this go to trial," Chen said with absolute certainty. "These aren't men who accept consequences. They've spent 5 years building their immunity, consolidating power, eliminating anyone who might threaten them. You come at them with evidence and testimony, they'll come at you with everything they have." "Then we better make sure we're ready," Claire said. "Tom, you said Coleman has connections. We need to know how deep those connections go. Who owes him favors? Who's compromised? We need to identify allies in law enforcement who aren't on his payroll. And we need to make copies of everything, distribute them so widely that destroying one set of evidence becomes meaningless." Tom nodded, his mind already working through tactical considerations. "Chen, you said Victoria copied all her evidence before she died. Do you know where she might have hidden other caches?" "She loved that Lakehouse," Chen said. "Said it was going to be her legacy, proof that you could build something permanent and good even in a broken system. If she hid evidence anywhere, it would be there. Somewhere that would survive even if the house was demolished. Somewhere that someone honest would find if they were looking." Grace spoke up, her voice thoughtful. "There's a compass in the Lakehouse, brass, engraved with Victoria's initials. The engraving says True North. When I found it, I thought it was just a decorative piece. But what if it's a clue? What if she was telling us which direction to look?" Tom felt the familiar electricity of a breakthrough, the moment when disparate pieces started forming a recognizable pattern. The Lakehouse faces north. The support beams run north-south. We found one evidence cache on the northeast beam. If Victoria was using directional markers, there could be more caches on the other support beams, Claire finished. We need to search them all. They spent another hour with Chen, recording his testimony on multiple devices, making sure every detail was documented. Every statement could be verified. Chen spoke with the precision of someone who'd learned that in military operations, details mattered, that vagueness got people killed. He described the boats Coleman and Hayes had used, provided timestamps based on his watch, recalled specific phrases from the argument he'd overheard. The testimony was devastating in its thoroughness. When they finally prepared to leave, Chen walked them to their vehicles. The rifle was gone, secured back in the cabin, and his bearing had changed subtly. Still wary, still alert, but no longer quite so haunted. "What you said about only being responsible for your own trigger," he said to Grace. "I've been telling myself the opposite for 15 years. Every Marine who died in my squad, every person who died because I didn't speak up, I put that weight on my own shoulders. Maybe it's time I stopped. Maybe it's time we all stopped carrying guilt for other people's choices," Grace replied, "and started carrying responsibility for our own. You're choosing to speak now. That's what matters." The drive back to civilization was quiet, each of them processing what they'd heard, what it meant, what it would cost to pursue justice against men who'd proven willing to kill to protect their secrets. Tom's phone had 3 bars of service by the time they reached the paved road, and it immediately buzzed with missed calls and voicemails. He pulled over and checked the messages. One was from Sheriff Mitchell, asking Tom to call him back urgently. Another was from a number Tom didn't recognize, but the area code suggested state police. The third was from a contact at the FBI field office in Minneapolis, someone Tom had worked with on a case years ago. "Everything okay?" Claire asked, pulling her sedan alongside his truck. "Not sure yet. I've got messages from law enforcement, multiple agencies. That's either very good or very bad." Tom called Sheriff Mitchell first, putting the phone on speaker so Claire and Grace could hear. "Tom, where the hell have you been?" Mitchell's voice carried stress that bordered on panic. "I've had 3 different agencies asking about you this morning. State police, FBI, even someone from the county commissioner's office. They're asking if you've been investigating the Old Cross drowning case, if you've been talking to the new owners of the Lakehouse." Tom's jaw tightened. How would they even know to ask those questions? I haven't filed any official inquiries. I don't know, but someone's paying attention. The FBI agent who called said they'd received an anonymous tip that evidence related to federal fraud might have been discovered at the Cross property. They want to interview everyone who's been there. Tom, what have you gotten yourself into? Tom thought fast. The FBI receiving an anonymous tip could mean someone was trying to help them, trying to get federally eyes on the case. Or it could mean Coleman and Hayes had gotten wind of the investigation and were trying to get ahead of it, control the narrative before evidence could be properly secured. Sheriff, I need you to trust me. Can you do that? A long pause. Depends on what you're asking. I'm asking you to not confirm or deny anything to anyone until I can get proper channels established. This is bigger than a local drowning case. It's federal fraud, it's murder, and it involves people with enough power to make evidence disappear if they get warning we're coming. Another pause, longer this time. Then Mitchell's voice came back, harder edged. Tom, I've been sheriff in this county for 12 years. You know what I've learned? When powerful men commit crimes, they don't face justice unless someone with courage and evidence forces the issue. If you've got both those things, I'll give you 24 hours before I have to start answering questions officially. But after that, I can't protect you. 24 hours is all I need, thank you, Mitchell. Tom hung up and immediately called his FBI contact. Special Agent Sarah Okafor answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the same controlled urgency that all good federal agents cultivated. Tom Brennan, I was hoping you'd call. I've got some interesting information that landed on my desk this morning. Anonymous email with documents attached, financial records, construction reports, audio files, all related to something called the Homeward Veterans Project. The email said you'd be able to provide context and corroborating evidence. Care to tell me what's going on? Tom's mind raced. Someone had already sent evidence to the FBI. But who? Not Chen. Chen. He'd been with them all morning, not Claire or Grace. They'd been surprised by the calls. That left only one possibility. Victoria Cross had set up a dead man's switch, something that would automatically release evidence if certain conditions were met. Maybe she'd programmed it to trigger if anyone accessed her hidden files. Maybe she'd scheduled it as a backup in case she died before the oversight meeting. Sarah, how fast can you get to Lake Whisper, Minnesota? If it's as important as these documents suggest, I can have a team there by tonight. Talk to me, Tom. What am I walking into? Federal fraud involving $8.7 million in veteran housing funds. Criminal negligence that caused 4 deaths. At least 1 murder, possibly more. Conspiracy, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation. The works. And the people responsible are a county commissioner and a major contractor with enough political connections to have buried this for 5 years. Sarah's whistle was low and impressed. That's quite an accusation. You have evidence that'll support charges? I have documentary evidence, financial records, eyewitness testimony, and physical evidence that proves premeditated murder. I have enough to convict everyone involved and expose a corruption network that probably extends beyond the local level. Then get that evidence secured and get yourself somewhere safe. If these people have killed once, they'll kill again. I'm mobilizing a team now. Where can we meet? Tom gave her the address of his cabin, reasoning that his isolation would make it easier to secure than the Lakehouse or any place public. They arranged to meet at 6 that evening, giving Sarah time to assemble her team and Tom time to gather all the evidence into one location. When he hung up, Claire was watching him with an expression that mixed hope and apprehension. We're really doing this. We're going up against Coleman and Hayes with federal charges. We're finishing what Victoria started, Tom corrected, and we're going to make sure Aaron Franklin's family didn't die for nothing. They returned to the Lakehouse to search for additional evidence caches, and Tom called Chen to update him on the FBI contact. Chen agreed to come out of hiding for an official interview, though his reluctance was palpable even over the phone. 5 years of paranoid isolation didn't dissolve in a single morning of testimony. The search of the remaining support beams yielded 2 more waterproof containers. One held additional USB drives with what appeared to be backup copies of all Victoria's financial documentation. The other contained photographs, hundreds of them, showing construction sites, material deliveries, meetings between Coleman and Hayes, and most damning of all, a series of photos taken inside the Franklin house 2 days before it collapsed, showing cracks in the walls, separation at the joints, and visible evidence of structural failure that any competent inspector should have immediately flagged. Grace found something else while they searched, A small wooden box buried in the garden behind the lake house, protected by a plastic bag and marked with a simple notation, "For Aaron's girls." Inside were drawings, the kind of crayon and marker creations that children make with absolute conviction that their art matters. Houses with flowers and swing sets, families holding hands, a little girl's vision of the forever home she'd never lived to see. Grace sat in the garden with the drawings spread around her, tears running down her weathered face, her breathing labored but her expression peaceful. Emma drew these. Aaron showed them to me during one of our sessions. He was so proud of his daughters, so excited about giving them a real home. Victoria must have kept them, must have buried them here so they'd survive even if the house didn't. Claire knelt beside her mother, and Tom watched these two women he'd known for less than 24 hours grieve for children they'd never met, for futures stolen by greed, for justice delayed so long that it might have been denied entirely, if not for chance and determination, and three broken people who'd found purpose in each other's brokenness. The afternoon wore on as they cataloged evidence, made copies, distributed backups. Tom's years of detective work had taught him that cases were won or lost on evidence security. Lose the evidence and you lost the case, no matter how guilty the defendants. He wasn't going to let Victoria's work be destroyed, wasn't going to let Coleman and Hayes escape through evidence suppression. At 5 that evening, with the sun setting over the lake and throwing copper light across the water, Tom's phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed a number he recognized immediately, one he'd hoped never to see again. Raymond Coleman calling from his personal cell phone, not the official county office number. Tom answered on speaker so Claire and Grace could hear. "Mr. Brennan, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Coleman's voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to and obeyed. "I understand you've been asking questions about some old county business. The Victoria Cross incident, the Homeward Veterans Project. I wanted to reach out personally, see if I could provide any clarification that might help you understand the situation more completely." "I understand the situation pretty completely already, Commissioner. 4 people died because you and Marcus Hayes stole federal money and used substandard materials. Victoria Cross was murdered when she tried to expose you. You've spent 5 years covering it up. How's that for understanding?" The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to confirm that Coleman hadn't expected such a direct accusation. When he spoke again, the smooth veneer had cracked slightly. "Those are serious allegations, Mr. Brennan. The kind that could expose you to defamation lawsuits if you can't substantiate them. I'd hate to see a man of your experience and reputation destroy himself over a misunderstanding. I can substantiate every word. I have Victoria's documentation. I have eyewitness testimony. I have enough evidence to put you in federal prison for the rest of your life. The only misunderstanding here is if you think you can threaten me into silence." Coleman's laugh was cold. "Threaten you, Mr. Brennan? I'm trying to help you. The new owners of the Cross property, Ms. Donovan and her mother, they've suffered enough losses already. It would be tragic if something happened to them because you encourage them to pursue a vendetta against people who are simply trying to serve their community." The threat was unmistakable. Tom felt rage building in his chest, white hot and pure, the kind of anger that in his younger days would have sent him driving to Coleman's house for a conversation conducted with fists rather than words. "Listen to me very carefully, Coleman. The FBI is already involved. Federal agents will be here tonight to collect evidence and testimony. You threaten these women, you so much as look at them wrong, and I will personally make sure you spend the rest of your life in solitary confinement in a supermax facility where your connections and your money mean absolutely nothing. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, Mr. Brennan, though I think you'll find that involving the FBI was a mistake. I have friends at the state level who take a very dim view of people making unfounded allegations against public servants. By this time tomorrow, you'll be the one facing investigation, not me. Enjoy your evening." The line went dead. Tom set the phone down carefully, his hands shaking with suppressed fury. Claire was pale but composed, her FBI training asserting itself even in civilian life. Grace simply looked tired, her oxygen saturation monitor showing numbers lower than they should be. "He's going to come after us," Claire said quietly, "tonight before the FBI arrives. He can't afford to let this evidence reach federal custody." "Then we need to be ready," Tom replied. "Chen's on his way here. He served multiple combat tours. I'm a former Marine and former cop. You're former FBI. Between the three of us, we can hold this position until Sarah and her team arrive. And me, Grace added. I may be dying, but I can still dial 911 and I can still bear witness if something happens. Don't count me out yet. They spent the next hour securing the lake house as best they could. Tom positioned himself on the upper floor with sight lines to the access road. Claire took the ground floor, her service weapon retrieved from her car, checking and rechecking the magazine with the automatic movements of someone whose muscle memory included mortal threat response. Chen arrived just after dark, his truck loaded with equipment that suggested he'd been preparing for exactly this scenario for 5 years. Grace sat in her chair by the fire, the oxygen concentrator humming. Emma Franklin's drawings spread on the table before her like a sacred text. She was praying, Tom realized, or meditating, or simply communing with the spirits of the dead who seemed to hover over this place like witnesses waiting for justice. At 7 that evening, headlights appeared on the access road. Multiple vehicles moving slowly, deliberately. Tom counted 4 SUVs, maybe 16 people if they were fully loaded. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Okafor. 15 minutes out. Helicopter had mechanical issues. Hold position. 15 minutes. Tom texted back a simple acknowledgement and then called down to Claire and Chen. Company's coming. 4 vehicles. FBI is 15 minutes away. We just need to hold until they arrive. The vehicles stopped just beyond the property line, close enough to block escape, but far enough to avoid immediate confrontation. Doors opened and men emerged, some in sheriff's deputy uniforms, others in the kind of tactical gear that suggested private security. Tom recognized Sheriff Mitchell among them, his face grim in the headlights. Then Coleman stepped out of the lead vehicle, and even from a distance, Tom could see the rage in his bearing. This was a man who'd spent 5 years believing he was untouchable, who'd killed to protect his secrets, who'd built an empire on stolen money and dead veterans. Now that empire was crumbling, and he'd come to stop the collapse through whatever means necessary. Mitchell's voice carried across the clearing, amplified by a megaphone. Tom Brennan, Claire Donovan, you're both wanted for questioning in connection with the theft of county property and the illegal possession of classified documents. Come out peacefully and no one gets hurt. Tom moved to the window, staying back from direct sight lines, and called out, Sheriff, you know that's bullshit. Coleman put you up to this. He's trying to seize evidence before the FBI arrives. Don't let him make you an accessory to murder. I'm trying to prevent a situation from escalating, Mitchell replied, but his voice carried doubt. Just come out and we can sort this all out at the county office. The FBI will be here in 10 minutes. Let them sort it out. You walk away now, you're clean. You stay and help Coleman destroy evidence, you're looking at federal obstruction charges. The standoff held for a moment, tension thick enough to choke on. Then Coleman grabbed the megaphone from Mitchell's hands. This is your last chance, Brennan. Come out or we come in. Either way, those documents don't leave this property. In the distance, growing louder, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors announced the arrival of federal authority. Sarah Okafor had made up lost time, and now the spotlight from the FBI helicopter flooded the clearing with white light that left no shadows, nowhere to hide. The SUVs that had carried Coleman's men suddenly seemed very small, very vulnerable, very trapped. Tom watched Coleman's face in the harsh light, saw the moment when the county commissioner realized he'd lost, that his 5-year run was over, that all the money and connections and threats meant nothing against the simple fact of federal agents bearing down on his position with evidence and warrants and the full weight of a system he'd thought he controlled. Stand down, Sarah Okafor's voice boomed from the helicopter's PA system. This is the FBI. Everyone on the ground, hands visible. This property is now under federal protection as part of an ongoing investigation. Mitchell dropped the megaphone and raised his hands, relief visible on his face even from a distance. Coleman stood frozen for a heartbeat longer, then bolted for his vehicle. He made it 3 steps before federal agents emerged from the tree line, weapons drawn, orders barked in the clipped, efficient tones of people trained to control chaos through superior discipline. Raymond Coleman, county commissioner, 3-term unopposed, friend of senators and judges, went down on his knees in the dirt with his hands behind his head, and Tom Brennan watched from the window of the Lakehouse Victoria Cross had built and felt something tight in his chest finally release. Justice delayed was not justice denied. Not this time. Not while people still lived who remembered the dead and honored them enough to fight. The FBI's tactical lights transformed the clearing into a stage where every movement played out under merciless illumination. Tom watched from the Lakehouse window as federal agents moved with the choreographed efficiency of people trained to control chaos through superior discipline and overwhelming force. Raymond Coleman knelt in the dirt with his hands zip-tied behind his back, his expensive suit now decorated with Minnesota mud, his political veneer stripped away to reveal the desperate criminal beneath. Special Agent Sarah Okafor emerged from the lead vehicle wearing the kind of tactical vest that made civilians nervous and criminals compliant. She was in her early 40s, Tom guessed, with the bearing of someone who'd earned her authority through competence rather than connections. Her eyes swept the scene with the systematic assessment of a chess player evaluating the board, calculating moves and countermoves 3 steps ahead. Tom descended from the upper floor, his knees protesting the stairs, but his mind clear and focused in a way it hadn't been for 3 years. Claire met him at the door, her service weapon holstered now, but her hand still resting on it, old habits dying hard even when federal backup had arrived. Grace remained in her chair by the fire, watching events unfold through the window with the serene expression of someone who'd made peace with mortality and found freedom in that acceptance. Sarah Okafor approached the Lakehouse alone, her hands visible and empty, showing respect for people who'd proven willing to defend themselves. She stopped at the porch steps, her eyes meeting Tom's through the open door. "Tom Brennan, been a long time since that money laundering case in Queens. You look like retirement hasn't been particularly kind to you." Her voice carried the particular blend of professionalism and wry humor that the best federal agents cultivated, the ability to diffuse tension while maintaining authority. "Retirement was going fine until I bought a lake house with a murder investigation attached to it." Tom stepped onto the porch, extending his hand. "Sarah, thanks for coming so fast." They shook hands with the firm grip of professionals who'd worked together before and trusted each other to some degree, though trust in law enforcement was always conditional, always earned anew with each case. "Your evidence better be as good as you claimed on the phone," Sarah said, her eyes moving past Tom to take in Claire and Grace. "Because I just arrested a county commissioner with connections reaching to the governor's office based on your say-so and some documents that could have been fabricated." "The documents are genuine," Claire said, stepping forward. Claire Donovan, former FBI Special Agent, Financial Crimes Division. "I was forced to resign 8 months ago after investigating Senator Whitfield's embezzlement. I know what real financial fraud looks like, and what Victoria Cross documented is textbook RICO predicates. Multiple actors, ongoing enterprise, pattern of racketeering activity." Sarah's eyes sharpened with recognition. "Whitfield, I remember that case. You were right about the embezzlement, but wrong about thinking the Bureau would let you prosecute a sitting senator without ironclad political cover." She gestured toward the clearing where agents were processing Coleman and his men. "Looks like you haven't learned to pick battles you can win. Or maybe I've learned that some battles are worth fighting even when you know you'll lose," Claire replied evenly. "The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Someone said that once. Seemed worth remembering." Sarah smiled, and it transformed her face from federal authority to fellow human being. "Edmund Burke. And technically he said good men, but I'll allow the gender update." She turned back to Tom. "Show me what you've got, all of it. I need to verify chain of custody, authenticate documents, and interview witnesses. If this is going to stick, it needs to be bulletproof from the first moment." They brought her inside and spent the next hour walking through everything they discovered. Victoria's journals documenting the fraud scheme with meticulous precision. The USB drives containing financial records showing $8.7 million diverted through shell companies. Photographs of substandard construction materials. Audio recordings of meetings where Coleman directed contract awards to Hayes Development despite competitive bids. The waterproof camera that had captured Victoria's murder on video, though they deliberately saved that revelation for maximum impact. Sarah reviewed each piece of evidence with the systematic thoroughness of someone building a case that would need to survive defense motions, appeals, and the kind of legal firepower that wealthy defendants could afford. She made notes, asked questions, requested clarifications, and gradually Tom saw her expression shift from professional skepticism to genuine outrage. "The Franklin family," Sarah said quietly, looking at the photographs Victoria had taken inside Aaron Franklin's house 2 days before it collapsed. "These cracks, this separation at the load-bearing joints, Any competent inspector would have condemned this structure immediately. Someone signed off on this knowing it would kill people. County building inspector was William Morrison, Claire said, pulling up the relevant documents on her laptop. He received a $40,000 payment from one of Cole's shell companies 3 days after signing the final inspection report. Victoria documented the payment, traced it back through 2 intermediary accounts, connected it directly to Coleman's financial network. Sarah took photographs of the documents with her phone, uploading them to the FBI's evidence management system in real time. Morrison's probably fled by now. Coleman's arrest will have triggered panic among everyone involved. We need to move fast. Secure all potential witnesses before they scatter. We have one witness who's already secured, Tom said. David Chen, former Marine, eyewitness to Victoria Cross's murder. He's outside in his truck, afraid to come in because he's spent 5 years convinced that talking would get him killed. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. You have an eyewitness to the murder, and you didn't lead with that? I wanted you to see the financial crimes first. Establish that this investigation had merit beyond a single witness who might be dismissed as unreliable, Tom explained. Chen has PTSD from combat. He's been living off-grid since Victoria's death. Defense attorneys will attack his credibility. But if you believe the fraud case first, then his testimony becomes corroboration rather than foundation. Sarah nodded slowly, respect showing in her expression. You still think like a cop. Good. We're going to need that. She stood and moved toward the door. Let's bring him in. If his testimony matches the timeline and details, we've got Coleman on capital murder. Chen entered the Lakehouse like a man walking into an ambush, his eyes cataloging exits and threats, his body language screaming flight response even as he forced himself to stand still. Sarah approached him with the careful respect usually reserved for trauma victims or fragile witnesses, her voice gentle, but her authority unmistakable. Mr. Chen, I'm Special Agent Sarah Okafor. I understand you witnessed Victoria Cross's death 5 years ago. I need you to tell me everything you saw, but before you do, I want you to understand something. She waited until Chen met her eyes. What you witnessed wasn't a boating accident. It was premeditated murder. The people responsible are in federal custody right now. They can't hurt you anymore. Your testimony will help make sure they never hurt anyone again. Chen's hands trembled slightly, and Tom recognized the signs of someone fighting their sympathetic nervous system, trying to override trauma responses with conscious will. Grace stood and crossed to Chen, taking his shaking hands in her steady ones. Aaron would want you to speak, she said quietly. You carried him out of Fallujah when he lost his leg. Now carry his memory out of darkness. That's what Marines do. They don't leave anyone behind, living or dead. Something in Chen broke then, or maybe something finally healed. He took a shuddering breath and nodded, and for the next 40 minutes he recounted everything he'd witnessed that night on the lake. Sarah recorded it all, interrupting only to clarify details or request specific descriptions. When Chen finished, his face was wet with tears, but his voice was steady, and Tom thought that maybe speaking truth was its own kind of medicine. Sarah played back the recording, verifying the clarity and completeness. Mr. Chen, this testimony is going to be critical to our prosecution. Are you willing to repeat this under oath in federal court? I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make sure they answer for what they did, Chen replied. I've been running for 5 years. I'm done running. Sarah's phone buzzed and she checked it, her expression darkening. We have a problem. Marcus Hayes isn't at his home or office. His wife called 911 an hour ago reporting that he'd left in his truck with a suitcase and several weapons. She thinks he's running. Tom felt cold certainty settling in his chest. He's not running. He's coming here. He knows this is where the evidence is, where the witnesses are. He's got nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Desperate men do desperate things. I've got agents securing the perimeter, Sarah said, but her voice carried doubt. The property is isolated, lots of tree cover, multiple approach vectors. If Hayes has military training and local knowledge, Marine Corps, 8 years active duty, Chen said quietly, served in the Gulf War. He knows small unit tactics, wilderness survival, how to move undetected through hostile territory. If he's coming, he won't come through the front door. The lights went out. Not a gradual dimming, but an instant plunge into darkness as the power to the Lakehouse cut off completely. Tom's flashlight was in his hand before conscious thought engaged, muscle memory from 25 years of police work asserting itself. Around him, others were doing the same, beams of light cutting through the sudden dark like laser designators. "That's the breaker box," Claire said, her voice calm despite the obvious threat. "Someone cut the power manually. They're already on the property." Sarah was on her radio immediately, coordinating with her perimeter team, but the responses she got were concerning. Two agents had gone silent. Another reported movement in the tree line but couldn't get a clear visual. The helicopter had returned to base for refueling, leaving them temporarily without air support. "Everyone into the interior room now," Sarah ordered, her service weapon drawn, tactical light mounted beneath the barrel. "Chen, you're armed?" "Always," Chen replied, producing a sidearm from beneath his jacket. They moved as a unit toward the bathroom, the only room in the Lakehouse without windows. Defensible if it came to that. Grace moved slowly, her oxygen concentrator now running on battery backup. The quiet hum, a counterpoint to the tension crackling through the air. Tom positioned himself at the doorway, covering the approach from the main room. Claire took the opposite angle, her weapon steady despite the years since she'd last needed it in the field. Chen moved to the window, using the darkness outside to mask his observation position. The first shot came without warning, punching through the wall 6 inches from Tom's head, the supersonic crack of the bullet arriving fractionally before the sound of the gunshot. Tom dropped flat, old training asserting itself, returning fire toward the muzzle flash he glimpsed through the window. Sarah was on her radio calling for backup, for air support, for anything that could turn the tactical situation back in their favor. "We've got an active shooter, federal agents under fire, officer down." Sarah's voice was crisp despite the chaos. "I need every unit you can spare to this location immediately." Another shot, this one shattering the window behind Chen, who rolled away from his position and took cover behind the heavy wooden support beam. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only the ringing silence of ears adjusting to the absence of gunfire. "Hayes," Tom called out into the darkness. "Marcus Hayes, I know it's you. This is over. Coleman's in custody. The evidence is secured. The FBI has everything. Running just makes it worse." Silence. Then Hayes' voice coming from somewhere in the woods, distorted by distance and darkness but recognizable. "Nothing's over. Not while you're alive to testify. Not while that evidence exists. I built this company with my own hands. I employed hundreds of people. I gave veterans jobs when no one else would. I'm not letting you destroy that because you found some old files. You killed 4 people because you used garbage materials to save money," Claire shouted back. "Aaron Franklin and his family died so you could pocket an extra few $100,000. You murdered Victoria Cross when she tried to expose you. How many jobs are worth that price?" Aaron's death was an accident. The foundation failed because of soil conditions, not because of the concrete. The inspector said so, the county engineer said so, everyone said so except Victoria, and she was wrong. "She wasn't wrong," Grace's voice carried clearly through the darkness, strengthened by righteous anger. "You watered down the concrete to save money. You knew it wouldn't hold. You knew people would die. And when Victoria documented your crimes, you killed her to keep her silent. But silence is broken now, Mr. Hayes. The truth has risen, and no amount of violence will push it back down." Another shot, this one striking the oxygen concentrator, which died with a mechanical wheeze. Grace's breathing immediately became labored as the supplemental oxygen cut off. Claire scrambled to the backup tank, connecting the tubing while Tom maintained covering fire toward the source of the shooting. "Grace, you okay?" Sarah asked, her medical training asserting itself even amid tactical crisis. "I'm fine," Grace gasped, though her pallor said otherwise. "Just keep him talking. The longer he talks, the closer backup gets." Tom understood the strategy immediately. "Hayes, you said you gave veterans jobs. Aaron Franklin was a veteran. Chen here, he's a veteran. Victoria Cross was a veteran. You served in the Gulf War, earned a Bronze Star. What happened to you? When did you stop being a Marine and start being a criminal?" The question hung in the darkness, and for a long moment, Tom thought Hayes wouldn't answer. Then his voice came again, closer now, moving position between shots. "You want to know what happened? I came home from Kuwait to a country that didn't give a damn about us. No jobs, no support, nothing but empty thank yous, and expect us to just fit back into civilian life like we hadn't seen our friends blown apart by artillery. I started Hayes Development because I wanted to give veterans the opportunities no one gave me. Good jobs, fair wages, a chance to build something that mattered. And somewhere along the way, you forgot why you started, Chen called out. You let money corrupt the mission. You became the enemy you fought against. Don't you dare judge me. Hayes's rage was palpable. You sit out there in the woods, hiding from the world, collecting disability checks while the rest of us actually work. I built something. I created value. I employed people. You killed people, Chen replied, his voice steady now, combat training overriding PTSD. And you're about to die for it unless you surrender right now. Federal agents are inbound. Helicopters, tactical teams, every resource the government has. You might kill one or two of us before they arrive, but you won't survive the next hour. Is that really how you want this to end? Killed by the government you served? The silence that followed was different this time, thoughtful rather than tactical. Tom used it to reload, to assess their situation. They were pinned down, but not in immediate danger if they stayed in cover. Hayes was alone, probably running low on ammunition, certainly running out of time before federal reinforcements arrived. The tactical equation favored waiting him out. But Grace's breathing was getting worse. Without proper oxygen support, her already compromised lungs were struggling. Tom could hear the wet rattle that suggested fluid buildup, the kind of respiratory distress that led to crisis fast. They didn't have an hour. Sarah, we need to medevac Grace, Tom said quietly. Her oxygen saturation is dropping. She needs a hospital. Sarah checked her watch, mental calculations visible on her face. Backup is 12 minutes out. Can she hold that long? Grace answered before Tom could. I've held on for 3 years longer than I should have. 12 more minutes won't kill me. But we need to end this. Hayes needs to know that surrender is his only option. Claire moved to the window, staying low, using her phone's camera to scan the tree line without exposing herself. I've got movement. Northeast corner, maybe 40 yards out. He's repositioning for a better angle. Sarah raised her radio. All units, we have suspect located northeast of primary structure, approximately 40 yards out. Use extreme caution. He's armed and has already engaged federal agents. The radio crackled back with responses from agents moving into position. The noose was tightening. Hayes had maybe 5 minutes before he'd be completely surrounded by federal agents with night vision, superior numbers, and authorization to use lethal force. Then the Lakehouse's door burst open and Hayes charged in, weapon raised, his face a mask of desperate determination. Time compressed into fractions of seconds as 3 trained shooters processed the threat and responded with the muscle memory of thousands of hours of training. Tom's shot caught Hayes in the shoulder, spinning him. Claire's caught him in the leg, dropping him. Sarah's would have been the kill shot, but she held fire as Hayes's weapon clattered to the floor, and he collapsed, screaming in pain and rage in the particular despair of a man who'd gambled everything and lost. Sarah was on him immediately, zip ties securing his wrists while she called for medical. Chen kicked Hayes's weapon across the room, clearing the immediate threat. Tom kept his weapon trained on Hayes until Sarah gave the all clear, only then allowing himself to breathe. Grace sat in her chair, oxygen mask pressed to her face, eyes closed in what might have been prayer, or relief, or simple exhaustion. Claire holstered her weapon and moved to her mother, checking vital signs with the efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times. Hayes lay on the floor, bleeding and sobbing, all the bravado stripped away to reveal the broken man beneath. I didn't mean for anyone to die, he kept repeating, like a mantra or a prayer or a confession he'd been holding inside for 5 years. The concrete should have held. The inspector said it was fine. It wasn't supposed to collapse. But it did collapse, Grace said, her voice muffled by the oxygen mask but carrying absolute clarity. It collapsed during a 6-year-old's birthday party. Emma and Sophia Franklin died because you chose profit over safety. Their father died trying to save them. Their mother died holding them, and you've spent 5 years telling yourself it wasn't your fault. Hayes turned his head toward Grace, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face. I think about them every day. Every single day. I dream about those little girls. I hear them screaming. I wake up and I can't breathe because the guilt is choking me. Good, Grace said simply. Because they're dead and you're alive, and that guilt is the price you pay for the choices you made. But you know what? Guilt without action is just self-pity. You want to honor those children? Tell the truth. All of it. Every detail of what you did and why you did it and who else was involved. Give the FBI everything they need to dismantle this corruption completely. Sarah knelt beside Hayes, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes hard. Marcus Hayes, you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, fraud, and about a dozen other federal charges I'm still calculating. Anything you say can and will be used against you. But if you cooperate, if you testify against Coleman and everyone else involved, the U.S. attorney might consider that cooperation when determining what charges to file. Hayes looked at Sarah, then at Grace, then at the blood spreading from his wounds. Coleman planned everything. The shell companies, the material substitutions, the payoffs to inspectors. I just did what he told me. I was weak, and I was greedy, and I wanted the money. But I never wanted anyone to die. But they did die, Tom said, his voice carrying the weight of 25 years of homicide investigations. And you helped cover it up. You murdered Victoria Cross to keep her silent. You threatened Chen to keep him silent. You've spent 5 years lying to yourself about what you are. You're not a veteran who made mistakes. You're a criminal who happens to have served. There's a difference. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, and through the shattered window, Tom could see spotlights sweeping the woods as federal tactical teams moved into position. The cavalry had arrived, too late to prevent the shooting, but in time to secure the scene and begin the methodical process of turning violence into evidence. Paramedics rushed in, working on Hayes with professional efficiency, while Sarah briefed the tactical team leader on what had transpired. More agents arrived to secure the evidence, to photograph the scene, to begin the documentation that would transform tonight's chaos into tomorrow's courtroom testimony. Grace's breathing stabilized with fresh oxygen from the backup tank, but her color remained poor and her vitals concerning. The paramedics wanted to transport her immediately, but she refused to leave until she'd seen one more thing. The camera, she said to Sarah, the waterproof camera that Victoria left beneath the house, the one that recorded her murder. I need to see it. I need to see Coleman's face when he killed her. I need to know that truth for certain. Sarah hesitated, clearly weighing the medical necessity of immediate transport against the psychological need for closure. Finally, she nodded and retrieved the camera from the evidence bags, connecting it to Claire's laptop. The timestamp on the video read November 3rd, 2019, at 11:47 p.m., the night Victoria Cross died. The footage was dark at first, just the ambient light of moon and stars reflecting off the lake's surface. Then boats appeared, running without navigation lights, moving fast. Victoria's voice, calm despite the obvious danger, speaking to the camera she'd mounted to her life vest. If you're watching this, they found me. Coleman and Hayes have been threatening me for weeks. I've copied all the evidence, hidden it in multiple locations. The Lakehouse will survive. Someone will find the truth. Her voice caught slightly. Tell Aaron's family I tried. Tell them I didn't let their deaths be meaningless. Then Coleman's voice, loud and angry. Victoria, we need to talk. You're making a mistake. The only mistake was trusting that you'd do the right thing, Victoria replied. I gave you a chance to shut down the project voluntarily, to return the money to make this right. You chose to threaten me instead. Hayes's voice, slurred with alcohol or emotion. We employed people. We built houses. We made a difference. You killed 4 people, Victoria said, her voice shaking now. You used substandard materials because you wanted extra profit. You bribed inspectors to sign off on work you knew was dangerous. You're criminals, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. The video showed Coleman's boat ramming Victoria's, the violent impact rocking the camera's view. Victoria's voice, frightened now, calling for them to stop. Hayes's boat creating wake, deliberately destabilizing her vessel. The moment of capsizing, water rushing over the camera lens, underwater sounds, muffled and distorted. Victoria's voice, distant now, calling for help. Then the most damning evidence. The camera, still recording underwater, captured sound clearly. Coleman's voice, clinical and cold. Make sure she doesn't come back up. Hayes crying, Ray, we can't just let her drown. She's already gone, and if she's not, she will be. We're in this together now, Marcus, all the way. The sound of engines idling, waiting. Then Coleman again, she's not coming up. Let's go. And Marcus, if you ever talk about this, you'll join her. The video continued for another 20 minutes, showing nothing but darkness and the distant sound of departing boats. Then the battery died and the screen went black. The Lakehouse was silent except for Grace's labored breathing and the quiet sobbing of Marcus Hayes, who just heard his own voice condemning him to life in prison. Sarah stopped the playback and looked at Hayes with something that might have been pity if it wasn't overwhelmed by professional disgust. Well, Mr. Hayes, I'd say that's about as clear a confession as I've ever heard. Capital murder, caught on video, with your voice identifying you as an active participant. I hope whatever money you made was worth it. Hayes didn't respond, couldn't respond through the weight of his own guilt and the reality of what he'd become. Coleman had been the architect of the crime, but Hayes had been a willing participant, and the law didn't distinguish much between the man who gave the order and the man who carried it out. Grace watched the video with tears streaming down her weathered face, but when it ended, she smiled. Victoria got her testimony, she spoke from the grave, and now everyone will hear her. The paramedics finally insisted on transporting Grace, and this time she didn't argue. Claire rode with her in the ambulance while Tom and Chen stayed to give formal statements to Sarah and her team. The process took hours, methodical and thorough, building the foundation for prosecutions that would dismantle Coleman's corruption network completely. As dawn broke over the lake, painting the water golden pink, Tom stood on the porch of the Lakehouse and watched federal agents process the scene. Chen stood beside him, silent but present, no longer hiding in the woods but standing in the light. She built it to last, Chen said quietly, gesturing to the Lakehouse. Vic always said the work you do in the world outlives you. Buildings, relationships, choices. All of it stays behind when you're gone. Makes you think about what kind of legacy you want to leave. She left a legacy of truth, Tom replied, and justice. That's more than most people manage. Sarah joined them on the porch, exhaustion evident in her face but satisfaction in her eyes. We found Coleman's personal files at his home. Records of every payoff, every bribe, every threat. He kept it all, probably as insurance against his co-conspirators turning on him. Turns out when you build a criminal empire on mutual blackmail, everyone keeps receipts. How many arrests are we looking at? Tom asked. So far? Coleman Hayes, the county building inspector, 3 members of the county commission, 2 state officials, and that's just the beginning. This investigation is going to expose corruption at every level of local government. You've done good work here, Tom, all of you. We just finished what Victoria started, Tom said. She did the hard part. She built the case, gathered the evidence, had the courage to stand up when everyone told her to sit down. We just made sure her work didn't die with her. Sarah's phone buzzed and she checked it, then looked at Tom with an expression he couldn't quite read. That was the hospital. Grace Donovan's condition has stabilized, but it's precarious. The doctor says the next 48 hours will determine whether she makes it or not. Claire asked me to tell you that Grace wants to see you both. Something about promises and purpose. Tom and Chen drove to the hospital in silence, each lost in thoughts about mortality and meaning and the strange paths that had brought them to this moment. Grace lay in intensive care, connected to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision, measuring heartbeats and oxygen levels and all the quantifiable aspects of a life that couldn't be quantified. Claire sat beside the bed, holding her mother's hand, looking like she'd aged a decade in the past 2 days. She looked up when Tom and Chen entered, managing a tired smile. She's been waiting for you. The doctor says talking exhausts her, but she insisted. Grace's eyes opened, and despite the oxygen mask and the pallor and the obvious weakness, they held the same fierce clarity Tom had seen from the beginning. She gestured for the mask to be removed, and though Claire hesitated, she complied. I'm dying, Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been dying for 3 years, but now I'm actually dying. The doctor says my lungs are failing, maybe days, maybe hours. But I needed to tell you something before I go. Mom, don't talk like that, Claire protested, but Grace squeezed her hand gently. Sweetheart, I've made my peace. I lived 3 years longer than I should have because I had a promise to keep. Aaron asked me for help, and I didn't give it in time. I swore I'd find out why he died, that I'd make sure his family was remembered. Tonight, I kept that promise. The people who killed him are going to prison. The truth came out. My work is done. She turned her eyes to the Tom and Chen. You two gave me that. You finished what I couldn't do alone. You honored my son's memory, Aaron's memory, Victoria's memory. You proved that truth matters, that justice is possible, that good people can still make a difference even when the system seems rigged against them. We couldn't have done it without you, Tom said, his voice rough with emotion. You were the one who kept faith when the rest of us wanted to quit. You believed in us before we believed in ourselves. That's what mothers do, Grace said, smiling. We see the best in people, even when they can't see it themselves. Tom, you spent 3 years hiding from life because you lost Margaret. But grief isn't meant to be a tomb, it's meant to be a teacher. You learned that this week. Don't forget it. She looked at Chen. And you've been running from Fallujah for 15 years. But you can't outrun your past. You can only integrate it, make it part of who you are, instead of letting it define you. Aaron would want you to live, not just survive. Chen nodded, unable to speak through the tears streaming down his face. Grace's breathing became more labored, and Claire replaced the oxygen mask despite her mother's weak protest. Grace's eyes began to close, exhaustion overwhelming even her formidable will. But before she drifted off, she whispered one final thing that Tom barely heard. Tell the house thank you. It protected the truth. That's what Victoria built it for. The machines continued their rhythm, measuring life in electronic pulses. But Tom knew with the certainty born of watching his own wife die that Grace Donovan was preparing to let go, had held on just long enough to see her promise fulfilled, and now was ready for whatever came next. He sat with Claire through the night, keeping vigil the way he'd kept vigil with Margaret, bearing witness to the ending of a life that had mattered, that had made a difference, that had honored the dead by fighting for justice they'd been denied. Grace died as dawn broke the next morning, her hand in Claire's, her breathing simply stopping between one moment and the next, as peaceful an ending as anyone could hope for. Claire wept quietly, and Tom put his arm around her shoulders, offering the comfort of presence because words would have been inadequate. She was ready, Claire said finally. She'd been ready for 3 years. She just needed to finish what she started. She did finish it, Tom replied. And because of her, Aaron Franklin's family will be remembered for more than a tragic accident. They'll be remembered as the victims of a crime that was finally punished. That's legacy, Claire. That's what your mother gave them. They held a small memorial service 3 days later at the Lakehouse because Grace had requested it in her final instructions. Just Tom, Claire, Chen, and Sarah Okafor standing by the water where Victoria had died and where truth had finally surfaced. They scattered Grace's ashes in the lake, watching them drift on the current, becoming part of the water that had held so many secrets and finally released them. She loved this place, Claire said. In the 2 days we spent here, she seemed more alive than she'd been in years, like the house gave her purpose. Maybe it did, Tom said, or maybe she gave the house purpose, hard to say which. Sarah had brought news. Coleman was cooperating in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, providing testimony that was leading to indictments at the state level. Hayes had attempted suicide in jail but been stopped, now under psychiatric observation. The corruption investigation had expanded to include federal officials who'd overlooked the fraud in exchange for campaign contributions. This is going to be the biggest public corruption case in Minnesota history, Sarah said. And it's all because 3 people and a dying woman decided that truth mattered more than safety. 4 people and a dying woman, Claire corrected, nodding toward Chen. Don't forget Victoria, she started this. 5 people then, Sarah amended, though Victoria's contribution was somewhat more permanent than the rest. They stood in silence watching the sun set over the lake, painting the water in shades of copper and gold, and Tom thought about the strange journey that had brought them all here, about the promises made and kept, about justice delayed but not denied, about the truth that refused to stay buried no matter how much dirt you piled on top. The Lakehouse stood behind them, solid and true, Victoria Cross's legacy made manifest in wood and stone, and the unshakable belief that some things were worth building to last. The federal courthouse in Minneapolis rose like a monument to the idea that justice could still prevail when corruption was exposed to sunlight. Tom Brennan stood on the courthouse steps 3 months after Grace's death, watching reporters gather for the trial that would finally bring Raymond Coleman and Marcus Hayes to account for their crimes. The morning air carried the bite of early March, that peculiar Minnesota cold that promised spring but delivered winter's final assault. Claire stood beside him wearing the kind of professional suit she'd abandoned after leaving the FBI, her posture straighter than it had been in months. The investigation had given her purpose again, restored something the forced resignation had stolen. She'd been working with Sarah Okafor's team as a consultant, her financial crimes expertise proving invaluable in unraveling the shell companies and money trails that Coleman had constructed over years of systematic theft. Nervous, Tom asked, though he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands kept checking the folder of documents she'd memorized weeks ago. Terrified, Claire admitted. Not of testifying, I've done that 100 times, but of this mattering. Of the jury actually caring that 4 people died so rich men could get richer. Sometimes I think we've built a system where that's just accepted as the cost of doing business. Tom understood the fear intimately. He'd spent 25 years building cases only to watch them fall apart because juries couldn't conceive that respectable people committed terrible crimes, or because defense attorneys turned victims into villains and evidence into confusion. The criminal justice system worked beautifully in theory and brutally in practice, and sometimes the gap between those two realities felt insurmountable. Grace believed we'd win, Tom said quietly. She died believing it. I figure we owe it to her to at least try. David Chen emerged from the courthouse looking like a man preparing for combat, which Tom supposed was accurate in its way. Chen had spent the past 3 months in therapy, working through PTSD that had been compounded by 5 years of isolation and guilt. The military had failed him after his service ended, but the VA counselor he'd finally agreed to see was slowly helping him understand that surviving when others died wasn't a crime, just a reality that required integration rather than denial. They're ready for us, Chen said, his voice steady despite the visible tension in his frame. Judge Warner wants all witnesses in the courtroom during opening statements. Says it'll help the jury understand the scope of what they're about to hear. Tom nodded and they filed inside, passing through security that seemed excessive until you remembered that powerful men facing life sentences had every reason to disrupt proceedings through violence or intimidation. Federal marshals lined the hallways, their presence a reminder that this trial had attracted national attention and potential threats from multiple directions. The courtroom was packed with reporters, victims' family members, and the merely curious who'd followed the case through months of pretrial motions and media coverage. Tom saw Aaron Franklin's brother Marcus in the front row, his face carved from the same grief that Tom had worn for 3 years after Margaret's death. Beside him sat Jennifer Franklin's parents, elderly now and diminished by loss, but present because bearing witness was all they had left to offer their dead daughter and granddaughters. Raymond Coleman sat at the defense table wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression calm and controlled. He looked like a county commissioner, like a public servant, like someone who'd spent a lifetime cultivating an image of respectability that made accusations of murder seem absurd. Marcus Hayes sat at a separate defense table, required by his cooperation agreement to testify against Coleman in exchange for the possibility of a sentence that might someday end. Hayes looked like he'd aged 20 years in 3 months, his face gaunt and his eyes haunted by the video of Victoria's murder that he couldn't unsee, couldn't unhear, couldn't reconcile with the man he'd once believed himself to be. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Elizabeth Warner entered, a woman in her 60s who'd built a reputation for running a tight courtroom and tolerating neither grandstanding from attorneys nor disruption from spectators. She surveyed the packed room with the cool assessment of someone who'd presided over enough trials to know that justice was a process rather than a destination, and that her job was to ensure the process worked as designed. "Good morning," Judge Warner said, her voice carrying the particular authority that came from 30 years on the bench. "We're here for the trial of United States versus Raymond Coleman and United States versus Marcus Hayes. Before we begin jury selection, I want to address everyone present. This case has generated significant media attention and public interest. That's understandable given the nature of the charges and the prominence of the defendants. But this is a court of law, not a theater. I expect decorum from everyone in this room. If you cannot maintain that standard, the marshals will escort you out. Is that clear?" The room murmured assent, and Judge Warner nodded to the prosecution table where Assistant United States Attorney Catherine Chen sat with Sarah Okafor and 2 junior prosecutors. Catherine Chen was no relation to David, despite sharing a surname, but she'd built her career on public corruption cases and had volunteered for this prosecution specifically because she'd grown up in a military family and took personally the idea of criminals stealing from veteran programs. Jury selection took 2 full days, with both sides exercising their challenges with strategic precision. The defense wanted jurors who trust authority and doubt accusers. The prosecution wanted jurors who understood that respectable people could commit terrible crimes and that evidence mattered more than appearances. In the end, they seated 12 citizens who looked nervous about the responsibility they'd accepted and determined to take it seriously. Catherine Chen's opening statement was masterful in its simplicity. She didn't start with the murder or the fraud. She started with Aaron Franklin's daughters, with Emma and Sophia, with the drawings they'd made of their forever house, with the birthday party that had become their funeral. Emma Franklin was 6 years old, Catherine said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. On the morning of October 15th, 2019, she woke up excited because it was her birthday. Her father had decorated their new house with streamers and balloons. Her mother had baked a cake. Her little sister Sophia, who was 4, had made her a card with crayons and glitter. Emma's birthday wish, if you believe in such things, was probably something simple. Maybe a puppy, maybe a new bike, maybe just another day of being 6 years old and loved by her family. Catherine paused, letting the image settle in the jury's imagination. By that evening, Emma was dead, crushed under the walls of the house that was supposed to protect her. Her sister Sophia died beside her. Their mother Jennifer died, trying to dig them out with her bare hands. Their father Aaron, a Marine who'd survived combat in Afghanistan, who'd lost his leg to an IED, but never lost his hope for a better future, he died trying to save them all. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Catherine picked up a photograph and displayed it on the screen behind her. Emma Franklin's birthday drawing of the house where she'd wanted to live forever. Flowers and sunshine and a swing set in the yard. The official investigation concluded that this tragedy was an accident. Foundation failure due to soil conditions. No one's fault, just terrible luck. But that was a lie. Emma and Sophia and their parents didn't die because of bad luck. They died because Raymond Coleman and Marcus Hayes stole $8.7 million in federal money intended to build safe homes for veterans. They died because those men used substandard materials to increase their profit margins. They died because greed was more important than safety, and political connections were more important than building codes. Catherine turned to face the jury directly. And when Victoria Cross, an Army veteran and engineer, discovered what they'd done and threatened to expose them, they murdered her too. They rammed her boat. They watched her drown. They waited until she stopped struggling before they left her to die alone in the dark water. Then they went home and slept peacefully while her body sank to the bottom of the lake. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks with the methodical precision of a military campaign. Financial experts testified about the shell companies and money laundering. Construction engineers explained how the concrete used in the Franklin house was barely 60% of required strength. The county medical examiner, granted immunity for his cooperation, admitted that he'd falsified Victoria Cross's autopsy report after receiving $200,000 from Coleman. Tom testified about his investigation, about the evidence Victoria had cached beneath the Lakehouse, about the meticulous documentation she'd created, knowing that powerful men would try to silence her. His 25 years as a detective lent credibility to his testimony, and the defense attorneys barely touched him on cross-examination, recognizing that attacking a retired cop who'd solved hundreds of murders would only make their clients look more guilty. Claire testified about the financial fraud with the kind of detailed analysis that made jurors' eyes glaze over until Catherine Chen brought it back to human terms. Ms. Donovan, in layman's terms, what did the defendants do with the money meant to build Aaron Franklin's house? They stole it, Claire said simply. They created fake companies, submitted fraudulent invoices, and pocketed the difference between what the government paid and what they actually spent on construction. The Franklin house should have cost approximately $1.2 million to build properly. Instead, they spent maybe $400,000 on substandard materials and kept $800,000. 4 people died so they could steal $800,000. The defense tried to attack Claire's credibility by bringing up her forced resignation from the FBI, suggesting she had an axe to grind against authority figures. It backfired spectacularly when Catherine Chen walked Claire through exactly why she'd been forced out. I investigated Senator Whitfield's embezzlement and proved he'd stolen campaign contributions for personal use. My superiors told me to drop the investigation because Whitfield had political connections. I refused, so they forced me to resign rather than face the embarrassment of a sitting senator being prosecuted by their own agency. Claire looked directly at the jury. I lost my career because I believed evidence mattered more than political convenience. I'd make the same choice again. Several jurors nodded, and Tom knew the defense had just strengthened Claire's credibility by trying to destroy it. David Chen's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the trial. Catherine Chen handled him gently, understanding that a combat veteran with PTSD required careful examination to keep him from shutting down under stress. Mr. Chen, can you tell the jury what you witnessed on the night of November 3rd, 2019? Chen took a breath and began the account he'd now given dozens of times, but the repetition hadn't diminished its impact. He described the fishing trip, the insomnia from PTSD, the need for water to calm the memories of combat. He described seeing Victoria's boat, recognizing her even at distance because she often worked late checking construction sites. He described Coleman's and Hayes's boats intercepting her, the argument carrying across the water, the deliberate ramming that capsized her boat. What happened after Ms. Cross's boat capsized? Catherine asked. She came up, tried to swim toward the overturned hull. Hayes used an oar to push the boat away from her. She went under again, came up maybe 30 seconds later, arms flailing. Coleman's boat circled, creating wake that made it impossible for her to get her bearings. She went under a third time, didn't come back up. What did the defendants do then? They waited, engines idling. I could see them watching the water. Maybe 10 minutes passed. Then Coleman made a phone call. I heard him say, "It's done," before he hung up. They left, running without lights. Mr. Chen, why didn't you report what you saw to the authorities? Chen's jaw tightened. Because 2 sheriff's deputies showed up at my place the next day, before I'd even heard about finding her body. They asked if I'd been fishing near the accident site. When I said yes, they mentioned how unfortunate it was what happened to Ms. Cross, and how sometimes people who can't mind their own business have unfortunate accidents too. One of them mentioned my VA disability payments. The other mentioned how easy it is for paperwork to get lost. I understood the message. The defense attorneys tried to shake Chen on cross-examination, suggesting his PTSD might have caused him to misinterpret what he saw. That darkness and distance made reliable observation impossible. Chen remained steady, his military training evident in the way he answered each question with precision. Sir, I spent 7 years in combat zones where the difference between accurate observation and faulty perception meant the difference between living and dying. I know what I saw. I watched 2 men murder a woman and then threaten me into silence. No amount of questioning is going to change those facts. But the most devastating evidence came from Marcus Hayes himself. His cooperation agreement required him to testify truthfully about everything, and Catherine Chen had prepared him carefully for what that would entail. Hayes took the stand looking like a man who'd already been convicted by his own conscience, and his testimony had the hollow quality of someone who'd stopped believing his own justifications. Mr. Hayes, did you and Raymond Coleman defraud the Homeward Veterans Project? Yes. Did you use substandard materials in the construction of Aaron Franklin's house? Yes. Did you know those materials were inadequate for the structural requirements? Yes. Did you and Raymond Coleman murder Victoria Cross? Hayes's voice broke. Yes. Catherine walked him through every detail, extracting admissions that Coleman had organized the fraud scheme, that Hayes had implemented it, that both men had known the materials were dangerous but used them anyway because the profit margin was too attractive to resist. Hayes described the night of Victoria's murder with the clinical precision of someone who'd replayed the events so many times they'd lost the ability to feel them. She was screaming for help, Hayes said, tears running down his face. I wanted to pull her out. I had a rope in my boat, but Ray said we couldn't, that she'd already seen too much, that if we let her live, she'd destroy everything we'd built. He said we were in it together, that if she went down, I went down, so we had to make sure she went down first. What did you do? I used the oar to push her boat away when she tried to reach it. I kept my engine running to create wake that disoriented her. I waited while she drowned. Hayes looked directly at the jury. I murdered her, not because I wanted to, but because I was weak and greedy and terrified of losing everything I'd built on stolen money. Coleman's defense attorney tried to salvage something on cross-examination, suggesting Hayes was lying to secure his cooperation agreement, that his testimony was purchased with the promise of a reduced sentence. Hayes simply shook his head. I'm testifying because I can't live with the lie anymore. I dream about Victoria every night. I hear Emma and Sophia Franklin screaming under the walls of the house I built to fall down. The sentence I'm facing in prison is nothing compared to the sentence I'm already serving in my own head. The defense called character witnesses, people who testified about Coleman's years of public service and Hayes's charitable work with veterans. They called their own construction experts who disputed the prosecution's claims about material deficiencies. They presented alternative theories about the Franklin house collapse and Victoria's death, suggesting mechanical failures and unfortunate coincidences rather than criminal intent. But they couldn't overcome the video. Victoria's waterproof camera, recovered from the lake bottom, had captured everything with brutal clarity. The audio was crisp enough to identify voices. The timestamp proved exactly when events occurred. And most damning, Coleman's own words condemning him from beyond Victoria's grave. Catherine Chen played the video on the final day of the prosecution's case, and the courtroom watched in horrified silence as Victoria Cross fought for her life while two men waited for her to die. When Coleman's voice came through the speakers, clinical and cold, ordering Hayes to make sure she didn't come back up, several jurors visibly recoiled. The video ended with darkness and the sound of departing boats, and Catherine Chen let the silence hold for a long moment before speaking. Victoria Cross knew they were going to kill her. She knew, and she prepared for it. She mounted this camera to her life vest. She spoke her final words to it, asking whoever found the footage to tell Aaron Franklin's family that she tried, that she didn't let their deaths be meaningless. Catherine's voice strengthened. Well, we found the footage, and we're telling you, the jury, that Victoria Cross tried. She documented the fraud. She exposed the corruption. She died fighting for justice. Now it's your responsibility to finish what she started. The defense's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt, on the possibility that Hayes was lying, that the video could have been manipulated, that circumstantial evidence wasn't proof beyond reasonable doubt. Coleman's attorney, a silver-haired litigator from Chicago who specialized in defending the wealthy and powerful, made an impassioned plea for his client's presumption of innocence. The government wants you to believe that Raymond Coleman, a man who served his community for 3 decades, suddenly became a murderer because of money he didn't even need. Commissioner Coleman is a wealthy man. His family has money. He didn't need to steal from a veteran housing program. The prosecution's theory doesn't make sense because it's not true. What you have here is a tragic accident that's been transformed into a conspiracy theory by people with their own agendas. But Catherine Chen's rebuttal was devastating in its simplicity. She stood before the jury and played just 30 seconds of the video. Victoria's voice calling for help. Coleman's voice, cold and certain. Make sure she doesn't come back up. Catherine turned off the video and looked at the jury. You heard Raymond Coleman give the order to murder Victoria Cross. You heard him with your own ears. Everything else is noise. The evidence is clear. The crime is proven. Justice requires conviction. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Tom spent that time in the witness room with Claire and Chen, none of them able to focus on anything except the knowledge that 12 strangers were deciding whether 3 years of investigation, months of trial preparation, and countless hours of testimony would result in justice or another failure of a system that too often protected the powerful at the expense of the powerless. When the bailiff called them back to the courtroom, Tom's heart was pounding with the kind of adrenaline he remembered from his first homicide case decades ago. Claire gripped his hands so tightly he lost circulation, but he didn't pull away. Chen stood rigid, his military bearing the only thing keeping him from shaking. The jury filed in with expressions that revealed nothing, and Judge Warner called the court to order with her customary efficiency. Has the jury reached a verdict? The forewoman stood, a middle-aged woman who'd worked as a nurse and understood that some mistakes weren't accidents but choices. We have, Your Honor. In the case of United States versus Raymond Coleman, on the charge of first-degree murder of Victoria Cross, how do you find? Guilty. The courtroom erupted in gasps and muted sob, and the kind of collective exhale that comes when tension held too long finally releases. Judge Warner gavelled for order, but her eyes showed satisfaction. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder? Guilty. On the charges of wire fraud 18 counts? Guilty on all counts. On the charge of bribery of a public official? Guilty. Catherine Chen read through 27 charges, and the jury's answer never varied. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Each verdict another nail in the coffin of a man who'd thought himself untouchable, who'd believed that power and connections could insulate him from consequences. Coleman showed no reaction, his face a mask of control even as his life ended in everything but the biological sense. Tom wondered if that was the final cruelty of men like Coleman, that even in defeat they refused to grant their victims the satisfaction of seeing them broken. The verdicts against Hayes were identical, though his cooperation agreement meant his sentence would be negotiated rather than imposed. As the marshals led both men from the courtroom, Marcus Franklin stood and simply said, "Thank you," to the jury, his voice thick with 3 years of grief, finally acknowledged by a system that had initially dismissed his family's deaths as an unfortunate accident. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Catherine Chen and Sarah Okafor for statements. Tom hung back with Claire and Chen, unwilling to claim credit for work that had been done by others, content to simply witness justice served after being denied for so long. A woman approached them cautiously, maybe 40 years old, with the kind of careful movements that suggested trauma survived but not forgotten. She extended her hand to Tom. "Mr. Brennan, I'm Rebecca Hayes, Marcus Hayes' daughter." She saw Tom's expression change and raised her other hand. "Please, I just need a moment. I need to say something." Tom nodded warily, aware that Claire had positioned herself slightly behind him, ready to intervene if this went badly. "I haven't spoken to my father in 10 years, Rebecca said quietly. "We became estranged when I was in college, after I realized he valued money more than people. I joined the army to get away from him, became a nurse, served 2 tours in Iraq. When I heard what he'd done, what he'd been doing for years, I wasn't surprised, just sad. Sad that the man who taught me to ride a bike was the same man who let little girls die for profit." She paused, gathering herself. "I came to the trial every day, listened to every word of testimony. I needed to understand how my father became someone capable of murder. And I realized something. He didn't become that person. He always was that person. I just couldn't see it when I was young." "Why are you telling me this?" Tom asked gently. "Because I read about the Homeward Veterans Project, about what it was supposed to be before my father corrupted it, and I want to help finish it the right way. I have medical skills. I have military experience. I have a trust fund my father set up that I've never touched because I didn't want his money. But maybe his money could do some good if it was used to actually help veterans instead of exploiting them." Claire stepped forward. "We're planning to rebuild the program, use it as a transition center for female veterans. Mental health support, job training, community. We could use a nurse with military experience." Rebecca's eyes glistened. "I'd like that. I can't undo what my father did, but maybe I can help create something good from the ruins of what he destroyed." Tom thought about redemption and legacy, about the sins of fathers and the choices of daughters, about how sometimes the best response to corruption was to build something honest in its place. He extended his hand and Rebecca shook it, her grip firm and certain. "Welcome to the team," Tom said. 3 weeks later, on a cold April morning, Tom stood with Claire and Chen and Rebecca at the groundbreaking ceremony for what they were calling Anchor Point. The Lakehouse stood behind them, restored and reinforced, ready to serve the purpose Victoria Cross had always intended. Around them, volunteers had gathered to begin construction on the support cabins, to transform Victoria's dream into reality. Sarah Okafor had driven up from Minneapolis to attend, taking a rare day off from the ongoing corruption investigation that had now expanded to include state officials and federal oversight agencies. The Coleman case had cracked open a network of fraud that extended far beyond one county commissioner and one contractor. "You know, Coleman got life without parole," Sarah said to Tom as they watched volunteers unload lumber. "Judge Warner handed down the sentence yesterday, said he'd violated the public trust in the worst way possible and that his crimes had resulted in the deaths of 5 people, including Victoria Cross. Hayes got 25 years with possibility of parole after 15, contingent on his continued cooperation." 25 years, Tom mused. Hayes will be 80 before he's eligible for release, if he survives that long. "The Bureau's also pursuing civil forfeiture," Sarah continued. "Coleman's assets, Hayes' assets, everything they gained through the fraud. The money's going to be used to complete the original Homeward Project mission, build housing for veterans, provide support services, create the program they destroyed." Claire joined them, her hands dirty from helping position foundation forms, her face more peaceful than Tom had seen it since they'd met. "You know what Grace would say about all this? She'd say that truth always rises. Sometimes it just takes people willing to help it surface." "Your mother was a wise woman," Sarah said, "and stubborn. In my experience, those traits usually go together." The ceremony was brief and informal. Just Tom saying a few words about Victoria and Aaron and Grace, and the belief that some things were worth building to last. They broke ground with shovels that had belonged to Victoria's construction equipment, symbolism that felt right even if it was a bit on the nose. As the volunteers began their work, Tom walked down to the lake shore where he'd scattered Grace's ashes 3 months earlier. The water was still cold, ice only recently melted, but the sun was warm on his face and the sound of construction behind him felt like promise rather than noise. Chen joined him after a few minutes, standing in comfortable silence the way veterans often did, communication happening through presence rather than words. "You doing okay?" Tom finally asked. "Better," Chen admitted. "The therapy's helping. Understanding that survival isn't a crime, that I can honor the dead without dying myself. It's slow, but it's working. Grace would be proud of you. She'd be proud of all of us." "Think she's watching?" Tom considered the question seriously, something he wouldn't have done before Margaret's death, before he'd learned that some mysteries couldn't be solved by evidence and logic. "I think if there's anything after this life, if consciousness persists in any form, then yeah, I think Grace and Victoria and Aaron and his family, I think they're watching, and I think they're satisfied." They stood together watching the water, two men who'd found purpose in finishing what others had started, in honoring the dead by living with integrity, in believing that justice mattered even when the system made it difficult. Behind them, Anchor Point was being built, not just cabins and dormitories and support facilities, but the dream that Victoria Cross had died protecting, the promise that Aaron Franklin had died believing in, the legacy that Grace Donovan had lived 3 extra years to secure. The Lakehouse stood solid and true, Victoria's engineering ensuring it would outlast everyone who'd known her, everyone who'd fought for her, everyone who'd murdered her. It would stand as testament to the idea that some truths couldn't be buried, some promises couldn't be broken, some purposes couldn't be denied no matter how much power and money tried to silence them. Tom Brennan, who'd spent 3 years trying to forget he was a detective, who'd bought a lake house expecting to find peace and found a murder instead, who'd met strangers who became allies and then became family, he looked at the water where Victoria had died and Claire's mother had been scattered and felt something he hadn't felt since Margaret's death. He felt grateful to be alive, purposeful in his actions, connected to something larger than himself. The fight wasn't over. There would be appeals and civil suits and the ongoing investigation into the broader corruption network. But the hardest battle had been won. Truth had risen. Justice had been served. And the dead could finally rest knowing they hadn't been forgotten. The sun climbed higher, warming the April morning, and from the construction site behind them came the sounds of hammers and saws and voices calling to each other. The soundtrack of something being built right, being built to last, being built in honor of those who'd believed it was possible even when the world told them to stop believing. Tom turned from the water and walked back toward Anchor Point, toward the work that needed doing, toward the future that honor demanded they build. Chen walked beside him, two veterans of different wars finding common purpose in the aftermath of battles they'd never expected to fight. And if the water rippled behind them in patterns that suggested something more than wind, if the Lakehouse seemed to settle with something like contentment as its purpose was finally fulfilled, well, Tom had learned that some mysteries didn't need solving. They just needed accepting. The truth had risen, the dead were honored, the living had work to do. That was enough. That was everything. That was grace in every sense of the word. 1 year after the trial, Tom Brennan stood on the completed deck of Anchor Point watching the sun rise over Lake Whisper, painting the water in shades of gold and rose that would have made Margaret smile. The lake house behind him had been transformed from a crime scene into a sanctuary, its rooms now filled with the sounds of women rebuilding lives that war and trauma had fractured. The air smelled of coffee and fresh lumber, and the particular hope that comes from people choosing to heal rather than hide. The expansion had exceeded even their ambitious plans. What started as Victoria Cross's single lake house and a dream had grown into 12 cabins arranged in a semicircle around the property, each designed with the same attention to structural integrity and human dignity that Victoria had insisted upon. Rebecca Hayes had proven invaluable in the development, her medical training and military experience, making her the natural choice to run the clinical programs, while Claire handled administration and Tom managed security and veteran outreach. Anchor Point now housed 23 residents, all female veterans transitioning from military service to civilian life, all carrying wounds that weren't always visible, but were always real. The program offered comprehensive support, PTSD counseling, job training, addiction recovery, trauma therapy, and most importantly, community. The women learned that healing wasn't a solitary journey, that some battles couldn't be won alone, that asking for help was a different kind of courage than the kind they'd learned in uniform. Tom heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Claire approaching with 2 cups of coffee, her hair pulled back in the practical ponytail she'd adopted during the construction phase and never abandoned. She'd changed in the years since the trial, softened in some ways and hardened in others. The particular transformation that came from discovering purpose after believing it was lost forever. Sarah called, Claire said, handing Tom his coffee. The appeals court upheld Coleman's conviction. All grounds for appeal denied. His lawyers are talking about trying to take it to the Supreme Court, but Sarah says there's zero chance they'll hear it. He's done. Life without parole. Final answer. Tom nodded, feeling satisfaction rather than vindication. Coleman's conviction had never been in doubt given the overwhelming evidence, but the appeals process had stretched on with the tedious inevitability of powerful men refusing to accept consequences until every legal option was exhausted. Now even that final denial had been stripped away. And Hayes, Tom asked? Still cooperating. His testimony helped convict 3 state officials last month. The prosecutor's office is recommending he serve the minimum 15 years before parole eligibility. Rebecca's been visiting him monthly, says he's a different person in prison, that losing everything stripped away the parts of him that were corrupted and left something more honest underneath. Tom thought about redemption and whether it was possible for men who'd murdered for money, who'd watched a woman drown and felt nothing but relief that their secrets would stay buried. He wanted to believe people could change, that even the worst choices didn't define someone forever. But he also knew that forgiveness was easier to grant in theory than in practice, especially when the victims couldn't speak for themselves. Grace would say that everyone deserves a chance at redemption, Claire said, reading his thoughts the way she'd learned to do over a year of working closely together. She believed that transformation was always possible if someone had the courage to face what they'd done and commit to being better. Your mother was more forgiving than I'll ever be, Tom admitted. I spent 25 years as a cop. I've seen too many sociopaths claim redemption to manipulate parole boards. Sometimes people are just broken in ways that can't be fixed. Maybe, but sometimes people are broken in ways that can heal if given the right environment and enough time. That's what we're building here, isn't it? A place where broken people can become whole again. Tom couldn't argue with that. Anchor Point existed because Victoria Cross had believed that veterans deserved homes built with integrity, because Grace Donovan had believed that promises to the dead mattered, because Claire and Tom and Chen and Rebecca had all believed that sometimes the right response to corruption was to build something honest in its ruins. The first residents began emerging from their cabins, preparing for the morning community meeting that had become a daily ritual. Tom recognized each woman by name now, knew their service histories and their struggles and their small victories. There was Maria, who'd served 3 tours in Iraq as a combat medic and came to Anchor Point unable to sleep without nightmares of soldiers she couldn't save. She'd been there 8 months now and had started volunteering at the local hospital, finding that healing others helped heal herself. Jennifer had been a military police officer in Afghanistan, medically discharged after a traumatic brain injury left her with memory issues and chronic pain. She'd spent 2 years homeless before a VA counselor connected her with Anchor Point. Now she managed the facility's maintenance schedule with the same precision she'd once used to coordinate security patrols. Sarah, the most recent arrival, was still in the acute phase of PTSD, startling at loud sounds and struggling with the transition from the hypervigilance of combat to the relative safety of civilian life. She reminded Tom of Chen in those early days, before therapy and community had started building bridges across the chasm between who she'd been and who she was trying to become. David Chen himself had become Anchor Point's construction supervisor and lead carpenter. His off-grid cabin now abandoned in favor of a small apartment he'd built in one of the support buildings. Tom watched him emerge from the workshop carrying lumber for a new project, his movements purposeful in a way they hadn't been during those first terrified days after Victoria's murder. Therapy had helped, but so had meaningful work in a community that understood what it meant to carry guilt for surviving when others didn't. The morning meeting gathered everyone in the main hall of Victoria's Lakehouse, and Rebecca Hayes called the group to order with the gentle authority she'd cultivated over months of learning to lead without commanding. The meetings followed a simple structure. Each resident shared one thing they were grateful for and one challenge they were facing. No advice unless requested, no judgment regardless of what was shared, just bearing witness to each other's journeys with the understanding that being seen and heard was itself a form of healing. When it was Tom's turn to speak, he found himself talking about Margaret, something he hadn't done in the 3 years since her death beyond the necessary conversations with doctors and funeral directors and well-meaning friends who couldn't understand that some losses didn't diminish with time. I'm grateful that my wife Margaret died before she could see how completely I gave up after she was gone, Tom said, his voice steady despite the emotion underneath. She believed in living with purpose, in serving something larger than yourself, in making choices that honored the people you'd lost by refusing to waste the life they no longer had. I spent 3 years doing the opposite, hiding in isolation and telling myself it was grief when it was really just cowardice. Coming here, building this place, finishing what Victoria and Grace started, it's the first thing I've done since Margaret died that I think she'd approve of. Claire reached over and squeezed his hand, and around the circle, women who understood loss and purposelessness in the slow climb back toward meaning nodded with recognition. After the meeting, Tom found Sarah Martinez, the newest resident, sitting alone by the lake, staring at the water with the 1,000-yard stare he recognized from too many combat veterans. He approached slowly, making enough noise that she'd hear him coming, giving her time to process his presence before he entered her personal space. Mind if I sit? Tom asked, gesturing to the empty dock space beside her. Sarah shrugged, which Tom took as permission. He lowered himself to the weathered wood, his knees protesting the movement in their usual way, and for a moment they sat in silence, watching the water lap against the supports. Everyone keeps telling me it gets better, Sarah finally said. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the feeling like I'm still in Kandahar even though I've been home for 6 months. They say time heals, that therapy works, that one day I'll feel normal again. But what if I don't? What if this is just who I am now? Tom had heard variations of this question from dozens of veterans over the years, each one asking in their own way whether damage could be undone or if survival meant learning to live with permanent injury. I'm not going to lie to you and say you'll ever be who you were before deployment, Tom said carefully. Combat changes people in fundamental ways. You've seen things and done things that can't be unseen or undone. But that doesn't mean you're broken beyond repair. It means you're different now. And part of healing is accepting that difference instead of trying to resurrect a version of yourself that doesn't exist anymore. Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes evaluating whether he was offering platitudes or truth. You're not a therapist. What makes you qualified to tell me about healing from trauma? I'm not qualified. I'm just a retired cop who spent 3 years trying to drink himself to death after his wife died. I failed at dying, which turned out to be lucky because I found something worth living for instead. This place, these people, the idea that even when the system fails, ordinary people can still fight for justice and win sometimes. That gave me purpose, and purpose is better than therapy for keeping you alive long enough for the therapy to work. Sarah smiled despite herself, a small crack in the armor of despair she'd worn since arriving. My therapist says I need to find meaning in civilian life that matches the meaning I found in service. But I don't know what that looks like. I was a squad leader. I had a mission, a team, a clear objective. Now I have nothing except memories and medication and the knowledge that half my squad didn't make it home. Tom nodded, understanding. David Chen, our construction supervisor, he was a squad leader too. Lost 7 Marines in Fallujah, including the man who became the reason we're all here. Chen spent 5 years hiding in the woods, convinced he didn't deserve to live when better men had died. Then he found that honoring the dead meant living with integrity, not dying with guilt. You should talk to him. He understands the specific hell you're describing. They sat quietly for a while longer, and Tom let the silence work its own kind of therapy. Finally, Sarah stood and brushed off her jeans. Thanks for not telling me everything's going to be okay. I appreciate honesty more than optimism. Everything might not be okay, Tom replied, but it can be better than it is now. That's usually enough to keep going. As Sarah walked back toward her cabin, Tom remained on the dock, watching the water where Victoria Cross had died, and where Grace Donovan's ashes had been scattered, and where truth had finally risen after years of burial. The Lakehouse had become a living memorial to the idea that justice mattered, that integrity mattered, that building something permanent and good was the best response to corruption and death. Later that afternoon, a familiar truck pulled up the access road, and Tom recognized the driver immediately. Marcus Franklin, Aaron's brother, the federal prosecutor who'd helped coordinate the legal assault that brought down Coleman's corruption network. He'd visited Anchor Point several times since its opening, always unannounced, always staying just long enough to see that the dream his brother had died believing in was finally being realized. Marcus approached Tom with the same controlled grief he'd worn throughout the trial, the posture of a man who'd lost family and found purpose in pursuing justice for them, but couldn't quite let go of the absence their deaths had created. "Tom, I hope I'm not interrupting." "Never an interruption, coffee?" They sat on the porch of the Lakehouse, the same spot where Tom had first met Grace and Claire, where the investigation had really begun, where everything had changed. Marcus accepted the coffee with the automatic politeness of someone raised to mind his manners, even when his heart was breaking. "I brought something," Marcus said, pulling a folder from his bag. "Thought you should see it before it becomes public record." The folder contained a settlement agreement between the federal government and the families of everyone who'd been harmed by the Homeward Veterans fraud. $15 million divided among the Franklin family survivors, Victoria Cross's estate, and a fund established to support Anchor Point's ongoing operations. The money had been recovered through civil forfeiture of Coleman's and Hayes' assets, liquidation of the shell companies, and fines levied against the banks and financial institutions that had facilitated the money laundering. $15 million, Tom said quietly. "No amount of money brings them back." "No," Marcus agreed, "but money can ensure that their deaths led to something good. The Franklin Family Memorial Fund will provide scholarships for children of disabled veterans. Victoria Cross's estate is being used to fund engineering programs for women in the military. And Anchor Point gets operational support for the next 10 years, guaranteed." Tom thought about Emma and Sophia Franklin, about the birthday party that became a funeral, about the drawings of a forever house that now hung in Anchor Point's main hall as a reminder of what was lost and what was being built in response to that loss. "Your brother would be proud of what you've done," Tom said. "Grace told me that Aaron called her the night before the house collapsed, asked for help because he knew something was wrong. She didn't get to help him then, but she made sure that his death mattered, that it led to change. That's legacy." Marcus's eyes glistened. "Mom and Dad ask about this place every time I see them. They're too old to visit, too frail to make the trip. But they wanted me to tell you that knowing Aaron's death meant something, that it prevented other families from suffering the same fate. It helps. Not enough to stop the grief, but enough to live with it." They sat in silence for a while, two men connected by tragedy, and the belief that responding to tragedy with purpose was the only sane response available. Eventually, Marcus stood to leave, but at the door he paused. "One more thing. The state legislature is considering a bill they're calling the Franklin Cross Veteran Housing Integrity Act. It would require independent third-party inspections of all government-funded veteran housing, mandate whistleblower protections for people who report fraud, and create criminal penalties for officials who retaliate against those whistleblowers. The bill has bipartisan support. It's going to pass." Tom felt something release in his chest, some final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Victoria's documentation had exposed one corruption scheme, but laws would prevent future ones. That was justice extending beyond individual cases, systemic change emerging from individual courage. "Grace would say that's how the dead live on," Tom said, "through the changes their lives and deaths inspire in the living." After Marcus left, Tom walked through Anchor Point's facilities, conducting the evening security check that was part ritual and part meditation. He passed the workshop where Chen was teaching 3 residents advanced carpentry, passing on skills while building community. He passed the clinic where Rebecca was conducting a group therapy session, helping women process trauma in a space designed for healing rather than judgment. He passed the memorial garden that Claire had established, where plaques honored Victoria Cross, Aaron Franklin and his family, and Grace Donovan. The garden was simple but profound, native plants that required little maintenance, a stone bench facing the lake, and brass compass roses embedded in the pathway marking true north. Residents often came here to sit in silence, to remember their own dead, to contemplate the difference between surviving and living. Tom found Claire in the office, working on grant applications that would fund expanded services. She looked up when he entered and smiled with the particular warmth reserved for people who'd become family, not through blood, but through shared purpose and sustained commitment. Marcus was here, Tom said, brought news about the settlement and the legislation. Claire set down her pen. Is it wrong that I don't feel victorious? We won. We exposed the corruption, convicted the guilty, recovered the money, changed the laws. We did everything right. But Victoria's still dead. Aaron and his family are still dead. Grace is still dead. All the justice in the world doesn't bring them back. Tom sat across from her, recognizing the particular exhaustion that came not from physical labor, but from carrying the weight of the dead's expectations and the living's needs simultaneously. Victory isn't bringing them back, Tom said gently. Victory is making sure their deaths mattered, that they led to change, that other people didn't suffer the same fate. We can't resurrect the dead, Claire. We can only honor them by living with integrity and fighting for justice even when the system makes it hard. Grace used to say something similar, Claire said, her voice thick with the remembered loss. She'd say that the dead don't need our grief as much as they need our action, that the best memorial is a life lived in service to the values the dead held dear. Your mother was uncommonly wise. She had a lot of practice. My father died when I was 16, police officer killed in the line of duty. Mom spent years figuring out how to honor his memory without being paralyzed by his absence. She learned that grief without purpose becomes depression, but grief with purpose becomes advocacy. Tom thought about Margaret, about the 3 years he'd spent paralyzed rather than purposeful, about how buying a Lakehouse for $850 had led to everything that came after. Sometimes the smallest decisions created the largest consequences, and there was no way to know which choices mattered until you looked back from a distance. I miss her, Claire said simply. I miss my mom. Some days I'll think of something funny and reach for my phone to call her before I remember she's gone. The grief comes in waves and I never know what's going to trigger it. That never stops, Tom said from experience. You just learn to swim better. Evening fell over Anchor Point, and the community gathered for dinner the way they did every night, sharing food and conversation in the particular comfort of being among people who understood what service cost and what healing required. Tom sat at the head of the table not because he was in charge, but because the residents had collectively decided he belonged there. A father figure for women who'd often lacked positive male role models and now needed to learn that not all authority figures were threats. Rebecca Hayes said grace before the meal, a simple thanksgiving that honored the food and the hands that prepared it in the journey that brought everyone to this table. Tom bowed his head and listened to her voice, thinking about how the daughter of a murderer had become an instrument of healing, how redemption was always possible if someone had courage to pursue it. After dinner, Tom found himself back at the lakeside, drawn to the water the way he'd been drawn every evening since Grace's death. He liked to think that some part of her remained here, that the ashes scattered on the water had become part of the lake's memory, that Victoria's spirit still occupied the house she'd built with such care. Chen joined him after a few minutes, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to respect other people's solitude while offering companionship if it was wanted. You okay? Chen asked. Yeah, just thinking about how we got here, all the choices and chances that led to this moment. If I hadn't bought the Lakehouse, if Claire and Grace hadn't moved in, if you hadn't found the courage to testify, none of this would exist. Meant to be, maybe, Chen suggested. I'm not usually one for cosmic explanations, but sometimes it feels like Victoria orchestrated everything from beyond the grave. Like she knew exactly what needed to happen and set it all in motion before they killed her. Tom smiled. Grace would love that interpretation. She believed in purpose beyond coincidence, in connections that transcended normal explanation. I always thought she was being overly mystical, but the older I get, the less certain I am about anything. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge as darkness deepened. Finally, Chen spoke again. I got accepted into the counseling program at the university. Start classes in the fall. Figure if I'm going to help veterans build houses, I should also learn to help them rebuild themselves. Tom clasped Chen's shoulder with genuine pride. That's good, David. Really good. The residents here respond to you because you've been where they are. You understand the journey from broken to whole. Formal training will just give you tools to do what you're already doing naturally. Think I can balance school and work here? I think if anyone can do it, you can. Marines don't quit just because things get hard. Semper Fi, Chen said quietly. And Tom heard in those two words everything that brotherhood meant. All the promises made and kept. All the sacrifices honored through living with integrity. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning that reminded Tom of the day he'd first seen the Lakehouse, Anchor Point celebrated its official dedication ceremony with dignitaries and donors, and the kind of media coverage that made everyone slightly uncomfortable, but served the larger purpose of raising awareness about veteran transition challenges. The governor gave a speech about Minnesota's commitment to its service members. Sarah Okafor represented the FBI and spoke about the investigation that had exposed systemic corruption. Catherine Chen, fresh from prosecuting her 10th public corruption case, talked about how one woman's courage to document the truth had led to sweeping reforms. But the most moving speech came from Sarah Martinez, the combat veteran who'd arrived 6 months earlier, convinced she'd never heal, never find purpose, never feel whole again. She stood at the podium wearing business casual instead of camouflage, her posture straight but no longer rigidly military, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. I came to Anchor Point broken, Sarah said simply. I'd lost my squad, lost my sense of purpose, lost any belief that civilian life could offer meaning comparable to what I'd found in uniform. I was 3 days away from suicide when the VA counselor gave me this address and said that maybe I should try one more thing before giving up entirely. The crowd was absolutely silent. Sarah continued, I'm not going to tell you I'm cured. PTSD doesn't work that way. I still have nightmares. I still startle at loud noises. I still carry the weight of friends who didn't make it home. But I've learned that carrying weight doesn't mean being crushed by it. That healing isn't about becoming who you were before trauma, but about integrating what happened into who you're becoming. She gestured to the building surrounding the original Lakehouse. This place was built by a woman who believed veterans deserved homes built with integrity. It was saved by people who believed truth mattered more than political convenience. It exists because ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things in service of values larger than themselves. That's the lesson I've learned here. That meaning doesn't come from waiting for life to feel meaningful. It comes from choosing to serve something beyond yourself and committing to that service even when it's hard. Tom watched from the audience as Sarah finished her speech to sustained applause, and he felt the particular satisfaction that came from witnessing transformation. From seeing someone move from despair to purpose, from isolation to community, from merely surviving to actively living. After the ceremony, Tom found himself cornered by a reporter from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune who wanted to do a feature story about the investigation and trial. Tom deflected most questions, redirecting credit to Victoria's documentation, to Grace's determination, to Claire's expertise, to Chen's testimony, to everyone except himself. But you were the one who tied it all together, the reporter pressed. Without your investigation, Coleman and Hayes would still be free. Without Victoria Cross's courage to document everything, there'd have been nothing to investigate, Tom corrected. Without Grace Donovan's refusal to let her promise to Aaron Franklin die with her, I'd never have gotten involved. Without Claire's financial expertise, we couldn't have proven the fraud. Without David Chen's eyewitness testimony, we couldn't have proven the murder. I just did what any decent cop would do when presented with overwhelming evidence of a crime. I followed that evidence where it led, and it led to the complete dismantling of a corruption network, criminal justice reform, and this facility that's already helped dozens of veterans. That's more than most people accomplish in a lifetime. Tom thought about Margaret, about the 3 years he'd wasted hiding from life instead of living it, about how close he'd come to spending the rest of his existence in isolated grief. I spent 3 years doing nothing after my wife died, Tom said honestly. 3 years of feeling sorry for myself and pretending isolation was healing. If I'd stayed on that path, I'd have died alone in a cabin, having accomplished nothing except outliving the person I loved. Instead, I bought a lake house that needed me, met people who gave me purpose, and found that the best way to honor the dead is to fight for the living. The reporter scribbled notes, clearly seeing a human interest angle, but Tom was already walking away, drawn back to the lakeside where Claire and Chen and Rebecca stood watching the crowd disperse. They'd become a family of sorts, these people bound together by tragedy and choice and the determination to build something good from something terrible. Think we did it? Claire asked. Think we actually finished what Victoria and Mom started? Tom considered the question seriously. I think we started something they'd approve of, but the work's never really finished. There'll always be veterans who need help, always be corruption that needs exposing, always be people who need to be reminded that integrity matters. We just proved it's possible to fight and win sometimes. Rebecca smiled. Grace told me once, right before she died, that the purpose of life wasn't to achieve perfection, but to make progress, to leave the world slightly better than you found it. I think we've done that. Chen nodded. Semper Fi doesn't just mean always faithful to the core. It means always faithful to the values the uniform represented. Honor, courage, commitment. We live those values through this fight. That matters. As the sun set over Lake Whisper, painting the water in shades of amber and crimson, Tom Brennan stood with the people who'd become his family and looked at the buildings they'd raised and the lives they'd changed and the justice they'd secured. Somewhere in the water, Grace Donovan's ashes had become part of the lake's memory. Somewhere in the wood and stone of the Lakehouse, Victoria Cross's integrity remained embedded in every carefully chosen beam and properly mixed foundation. The dead lived on through the choices of the living, through the promises kept and the values honored, and the work continued in their names. That was legacy. That was meaning. That was grace in every sense of the word. Tom pulled out his phone and opened the photo album he'd started maintaining when Anchor Point began operations. Pictures of residents arriving broken and leaving whole. Pictures of buildings rising from bare ground. Pictures of community forming from individual isolation. He added one more photo, Claire and Chen and Rebecca standing together at sunset, framed by the lake house that had brought them together and the purpose that kept them committed. He sent the photo to Sarah Okafor with a simple message. We finished what they started. Thank you for believing in us. Sarah's response came immediately. You gave the dead a voice in the living hope. That's more than most people manage. Well done, Tom. Margaret would be proud. Tom looked up at the darkening sky where stars were beginning to emerge and allowed himself to believe that maybe Margaret was watching. Maybe she understood that grief had finally transformed into purpose, that isolation had given way to community, that the man who'd spent 3 years hiding from life had finally found reasons to live it. The lake house stood solid behind him, Victoria's engineering ensuring it would outlast everyone present, a monument to the idea that some truths couldn't be buried, some promises had to be kept. Some battles were worth fighting even when the odds seemed impossible. Inside, lights burned warm against the gathering dark. Voices drifted out through open windows, women laughing, sharing stories, building the kind of bonds that came from understanding each other's struggles without judgment. The sound of healing, of hope, of home. Tom Brennan, retired detective, widower, accidental crusader for justice, walked back toward that light and those voices and the future that honor demanded they build. Behind him, the lake held its secrets and its memories and the ashes of a woman who'd believed that truth always rises, that justice always matters, that promises to the dead should be kept by the living. The water rippled with patterns that might have been wind or might have been something more, and if Tom chose to believe the latter, well, he'd learned that some mysteries didn't need solving, they just needed acknowledging. The truth had risen, the dead were honored, the living had found purpose. And somewhere in the space between what was lost and what was built in response to that loss, grace existed not as a person, but as a principle, not as a memory, but as a promise renewed with each day's commitment to living with integrity. That was enough. That was everything. That was the only victory that mattered. The choice to keep fighting, keep building, keep believing that ordinary people doing extraordinary things in service of values larger than themselves could change the world. One lake house, one veteran, one promise kept at a time. The stars multiplied overhead, infinite and eternal, and beneath them Anchor Point stood as testimony to the idea that some lights refuse to be extinguished, some truths refuse to stay buried, some purposes refuse to be denied no matter how much darkness tries to silence them. Tom Brennan stood on the threshold between that darkness and that light, and he chose the light, chose the work, chose the purpose, chose to honor the dead by living with the integrity they died protecting. And that choice, renewed each day, was the truest memorial anyone could offer. Not monuments of stone, but lives lived in service. Not words carved on plaques, but actions taken in alignment with values. Not grief expressed through isolation, but love expressed through commitment to finishing what others started. The door to Anchor Point stood open, warm light spilling onto the porch where Victoria Cross had once stood planning homes for veterans, where Grace Donovan had once sat dreaming of justice for a fallen Marine, where truth had finally surfaced after years of burial. Tom crossed that threshold into warmth and light and purpose, leaving the darkness behind not because it ceased to exist, but because he learned that the way to honor the dead was to choose life, to choose service, to choose love over fear, and action over paralysis and hope over despair. Behind him, the lake whispered secrets to the stars. Ahead of him, the future waited to be built. And in the space between memory and possibility, grace existed not as absence, but as presence, not as loss, but as legacy, not as ending, but as beginning. The truth had risen. The work continued. And that was enough.